Mexico is supposed to be paradise. For millions of Americans every year, it is exactly that. The beaches are real. The water is genuinely that blue. The food is extraordinary. The weather is warm. And the prices are low enough that a vacation that would cost thousands somewhere else happens for a fraction of that south of the border. But there is another Mexico that exists alongside the paradise version. It exists in the same towns, on the same roads, sometimes in the same restaurants and on the same beaches. It is the Mexico controlled by the cartels, the criminal organizations that have been fighting each other and anyone who gets in their way for decades. Where tourist towns pay protection money the same way a landlord collects rent. Where a wrong turn on a rural road can end a life before anyone on the American side even knows something has gone wrong. Today we are covering 10 horrifying cases of American tourists killed by the cartel. What you are about to hear happened to real people who made ordinary decisions and never came home. Section 1. David Hartley. Falcon Lake, September 30th, 2010. David Hartley was 30 years old. He and his wife Tiffany had spent the last 4 years living in Reynosa, Mexico, a border city in the state of Tamaulipas, because David's oil field company had moved him there for work. They had built a life together in Mexico. They knew the country. They spoke enough Spanish to get by. They had friends there, routines there, a home there. When the company relocated them back across the border to McAllen, Texas, in the fall of 2010, they were a week away from moving. 1 week. On September 30th, 2010, the couple decided to spend the day on Falcon Lake. The lake is a 60-mile-long reservoir built in 1954, where the Rio Grande runs along the Texas-Mexico border. Half of it sits in Texas. The other half sits in Mexico. David and Tiffany had been out on Falcon Lake before, just 1 month earlier, on personal watercraft, jet skis. They knew the lake. They felt comfortable there. That day, they took their Sea-Doos across to the Mexican side of the water to visit the old Guerrero Church. The church is a historical landmark, an old stone building partially swallowed by the lake when the reservoir was filled in the 1950s. When the water level drops low enough, the church tower rises above the surface, like something out of a dream. Tourists and photographers have been coming to see it for decades. David and Tiffany brought cameras. They took photos. This was a day out, a final memory before the move back to Texas. They finished at the church and turned their jet skis around to head home. That is when everything ended. 3 boats carrying armed men came at them fast from across the Mexican water. Investigators later determined there were 7 gunmen total across those 3 boats. The men were members of Los Zetas, one of the most violent drug cartels in Mexico. Falcon Lake had been a major drug smuggling route for years, and in 2010, a brutal war between the Zetas and their former allies, the Gulf Cartel, had turned the lake into a battleground. The Zetas controlled their side of the water with total force. Anyone who entered that territory without their knowledge was treated as a threat, a rival spy, a government informant, an enemy. David and Tiffany had driven their truck to the boat launch, using license plates from Tamaulipas state. They had traveled by jet ski deep into the old Guerrero area, a known drug smuggling and storage corridor. To the Zetas watching from the shoreline, the couple looked like Gulf Cartel scouts doing surveillance. The gunmen opened fire. David Hartley was shot in the head. He fell forward off his jet ski into the water. Tiffany pulled up alongside him and tried to lift him back onto her watercraft. She could not. He was too heavy, and the water was moving, and the boats were coming back toward her. She later said she heard God telling her she had to go. She left her husband in the water and fled toward the American side of the lake as fast as the jet ski would carry her. Bullets passed by her as she rode. She made it to the Texas shore. She was alive. David was gone. His body was never pulled from the lake. His jet ski was destroyed by the cartel. David Hartley, 30 years old, married 8 years, 1 week from moving home to Texas, disappeared completely from the world in the middle of an ordinary afternoon on the water. Tiffany Hartley went to the police immediately. She told them exactly what happened, and the skepticism that followed her story in the weeks and months after was something she had not expected. There were no other witnesses. No body had been found. Some law enforcement officials along the border publicly suggested the story did not add up. One border town official referred to her as a merry widow. Reporters questioned whether she was telling the truth. She sat across from television anchors who looked at her with suspicion while she described watching her husband die. The sheriff of Zapata County, Texas, Sigifredo Gonzalez, never doubted her. He had handled 4 previous incidents on Falcon Lake in the months before September 30th, each one involving American fishermen being confronted and robbed by Zetas in boats at gunpoint. Every detail Tiffany described matched what those other victims had reported. The cartel had stopped boats before. They had pointed machine guns at people's heads and demanded to know who they were. The Hartleys had tried to flee, and the shooting had started. It was not a new pattern. David and Tiffany had simply been the ones who did not get away. The investigation moved to Mexico, where Tamaulipas State Detective Rolando Armando Flores Villegas was assigned to lead the case. He worked it hard. Within days, he had identified 2 suspected Zeta members as the likely shooters, Juan Pedro and Jose Manuel Saldivar Farias, both already wanted by Mexican authorities on murder and robbery charges. He delivered documents naming those suspects to a local Texas television station. Days later, on October 12, 2010, Detective Flores was murdered. His severed head was delivered in a suitcase to a Mexican military post near the border. The message was so clear it needed no translation. The Zetas were telling the Mexican government, the American investigators, and everyone watching to stay out of Falcon Lake. Stop asking questions. Stop looking. The search for David Hartley's body was called off shortly after. Authorities later told Tiffany that her husband's remains had been destroyed, disposed of specifically to eliminate evidence. She was never given the details of how. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called the killing of Detective Flores absolute barbarity. The case drew attention from the highest levels of both governments, but the attention did not translate into arrests, not for years. In October 2012, 2 years after David Hartley was shot, Mexican naval forces arrested a man named Salvador Alfonso Martinez Escobedo in the border city of Nuevo Laredo. Martinez Escobedo was known as El Ardillo, which means the squirrel. He was 31 years old and was described by Mexican authorities as a regional Zetas leader across 3 northern Mexican states. They publicly linked him to both David Hartley's killing and to the 2010 massacre of 72 migrants. But Sheriff Gonzalez, the man who had been closest to the American side of the investigation from day one, told reporters he had serious doubts. El Ardillo was not on the list of 5 suspects Gonzalez had handed to the FBI. The sheriff said the man might have been responsible for the general area and the cartel operations there, but that did not mean he was the one who personally ordered or carried out the attack on the Hartleys. No one was ever charged in a court of law for the murder of David Hartley. No one was convicted. No one served a day in prison specifically for what happened on Falcon Lake on September 30th, 2010. Intelligence analysts from the Texas-based firm Stratfor published a report in the weeks after the shooting that laid out exactly why the Hartleys had been targeted. Their truck had Tamaulipas plates. They had taken their jet skis directly into the old Guerrero zone, which was one of the most heavily watched drug corridors the Zetas controlled. The direction they were traveling, the type of vehicle they used, the area they chose to visit, to Zeta scouts watching from the bank, it all read as Gulf Cartel surveillance activity. The report also stated that senior Zetas leadership immediately launched a damage control effort after realizing their men had shot American civilians. The shooters themselves, the report suggested, were likely killed by their own cartel afterward, because killing an American tourist was bad for business, bad for attention, and bad for the Zetas at a moment when they were already fighting both the Gulf Cartel and the Mexican government. David Hartley had been dead for nearly a decade when his former wife gave an interview in 2019 to a Colorado television station. Tiffany had eventually moved home to Colorado, where she had grown up. She had remarried. She had a daughter. She spoke about David with love and sadness in equal measure. She said she held his memory close, the adventures they had taken, the love they had shared. She said she had seen blessings come out of the darkness. She had also spent years as an outspoken activist, speaking to politicians and media about cartel violence along the border and about American victims who received no justice. She pushed for David's case to be treated as terrorism. She pushed for the U.S. government to take what happened at Falcon Lake seriously. The FBI kept David's case on the books, as open and unsolved. His body is still in Mexico. No remains have been found, identified, or returned to his family. Tiffany Hartley left the water on September 30, 2010, and David Hartley never came home. The lake he loved to ride on became the place where he disappeared from the world entirely, shot in the head by cartel gunmen who thought he was someone else, in waters no American tourist was supposed to be in that day, on a lake that looked peaceful from the Texas side and was anything but. 15 years later, no one has answered for what happened to him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves another American who disappeared into cartel territory while doing something he loved, and whose family spent 6 months searching Mexico for him before learning what the cartel had done to his body. Section 2. Harry Devert, Michoacán, Guerrero, January 25, 2014. Harry Devert grew up in Pelham, New York, just outside the city. He was French-American, holding dual citizenship from both countries, and from the time he was a small child, he had been drawn to the idea of going somewhere, anywhere. Everywhere? He told a story about his father taking him to a party when he was 7 or 8 years old, a celebration for a French sailor who was about to attempt to sail around the world alone. The sailor had knelt down so his eyes were level with young Harry's and asked him if he thought he was going to make it. Harry nodded. The sailor put his hand on Harry's head and told him it was important to believe you could do anything. Even if you did not make it, at least you would have tried. Harry carried that moment with him for the rest of his life. He went on to work as a stock trader in New York for a period, making real money, living the kind of life that looked successful from the outside. Then, he quit. He gave up the career, the salary, the Manhattan life, and started traveling. He went everywhere. He ran with the bulls in Pamplona and broke 3 ribs. He had a gun shoved in his mouth in Venezuela. He got chased at gunpoint in Colombia. He climbed in the Himalayas. He stood in front of waterfalls in Brazil, with his arms stretched wide and his face tilted toward the sky. He documented all of it on his blog, A New Yorker Travels, writing about the world with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed life was too short to spend behind a desk. He wrote that he had never met anyone on their deathbed who regretted chasing a dream. He wrote that he was a life observer, a world traveler, a thinker, an admirer. He wrote that he loved living. By the fall of 2013, Harry was 32 years old and living in Pelham again, working part-time as an algebra and Spanish teacher at a private school in North Carolina while planning his next adventure. He was fluent in Spanish. He had traveled widely through Mexico and Central America before. He knew how to navigate the region. He had been in genuinely dangerous places and come out the other side. The new plan was the biggest thing he had ever attempted. He was going to ride a motorcycle from New York City all the way down through Central America, across to Brazil for the 2014 FIFA World Cup, and then continue south to Ushuaia, at the very tip of South America. The whole length of 2 continents on 2 wheels. There was one problem. Harry Devert had never ridden a motorcycle in his life. He wrote about this openly on his blog in October 2013, with the casual confidence of someone who found the gap between intention and ability amusing rather than alarming. He said he was going to go to the DMV the next day, get his motorcycle permit, buy a bike, and hopefully ride it home without crashing. He described this as something that would be, in his words, an adventure in itself. He bought a green 2002 Kawasaki. He learned to ride it across America. He posted updates as he went, documenting the early legs of the trip with the same warmth and humor that made his blog popular. He was teaching himself something new at 32, alone on a machine he had never operated before, heading towards some of the most remote and dangerous terrain on the continent. His girlfriend, Sarah Ashley Shear, was following his progress from home. His mother, Anne DeVert, called when she could. The phone and internet connections were unreliable in parts of rural Mexico, so gaps in communication were not unusual. Everyone who knew Harry understood that he moved through the world on his own terms, at his own pace, toward places most people would never think to go. He crossed into Mexico and rode south. By late January 2014, he was in the state of Michoacán. Michoacán, in January 2014, was one of the most dangerous places in Mexico. The Knights Templar cartel had controlled the state for years, running a criminal operation that went far beyond drug trafficking. They taxed farmers, extorted businesses, kidnapped for ransom, and used extreme violence to maintain their grip on the population. At the same time, civilian self-defense groups called autodefensas had risen up across Michoacán and were fighting back against the cartel with weapons of their own. The Mexican government had sent thousands of troops and police to try to manage the conflict. Armed groups of various kinds were operating throughout the state. Roadblocks went up without warning. Men in military-style clothing stopped travelers. Some were actual soldiers. Some were cartel members. Some were autodefensa members. From the road, on a motorcycle, it was not always easy to tell the difference. Harry was aware of the tension. On January 25th, he checked out of a small bed and breakfast in Michoacán, in a town near the famous Monarch Butterfly Sanctuary. He sent a text message to Sarah, his girlfriend. He told her he had just received an hour-and-a-half-long escort out of some area that was too dangerous for him to be in. He told her there was apparently another military escort waiting for him in another town ahead. He was on his way to Zihuatanejo, the Pacific Coast beach that appears at the end of the film The Shawshank Redemption, a place Harry had specifically wanted to see. He was supposed to meet his brother Kerry in Mexico City on October 30. He was looking forward to it. That text message was the last communication anyone received from Harry DeVert. When he failed to meet Kerry in Mexico City on October 30th, the family immediately knew something was wrong. Harry was meticulous about keeping people informed of his location. He called his mother on his late father's birthday, January 29th, every single year. When he did not call, Anne DeVert felt it in a way she could not explain. She told CNN later that she had a misgiving, that she thought maybe it would take a couple of days, and then he simply did not call. She flew to Mexico. The family created a dedicated Facebook page called Help Find Harry. Within weeks, it had more than 25,000 people following it. They used the hashtag #FindPat in English and Buscapato in Spanish. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, whose state Harry taught in, got involved and made contact with Mexican law enforcement. The search was enormous, coordinated across 2 countries, amplified across social media, driven by a family that refused to stop. Mexican authorities searched. Locals in Michoacán, alerted by Anne DeVert's visits to the area, kept their eyes open. The working theory in the early weeks was that Harry had gone hiking and become lost in the Copper Canyon or surrounding wilderness. But that theory collapsed quickly when investigators confirmed that all of Harry's belongings, including his camera, his bags, and his personal items, were still at his last hotel. A man planning an extended hike does not leave his camera behind. 6 months passed. 6 months of silence, searching, and not knowing. On July 18, 2014, local police near the town of La Union, in the state of Guerrero, made a discovery. In a shallow area off a road, they found a green 2002 Kawasaki motorcycle. The vehicle identification number matched Harry DeVert's bike. Alongside it were 2 plastic bags containing the dismembered remains of a man. The location was approximately 40 miles from the tourist port city of Zihuatanejo, the beach Harry had been riding toward. Unspecified amounts of marijuana and cocaine were found near the scene. Ann Devert had previously been to the area and told locals to report anything connected to Harry or his motorcycle. That instruction is what led to the tip that brought police to the scene. She returned to Mexico immediately after the discovery. She provided a DNA sample to police in New York. On July 18th, DNA testing confirmed that the remains in those 2 bags were her son. Harry Devert had been murdered on January 25, 2014, the same day he sent his last text message. He had been dead for nearly 6 months while his family searched for him. The investigation was transferred from state prosecutors to federal authorities because of the nature of the crime and because it involved an American citizen. Mexican officials revealed that organized crime had been confirmed as the cause of his death. The specific group responsible, according to state investigators, was a local cartel offshoot called Los Guerreros, a faction linked to both the Knights Templar cartel and its predecessor, La Familia Michoacana, which had controlled parts of that region before splintering. Los Guerreros was a street-level enforcement gang that had filled some of the power vacuum left behind as the Knights Templar weakened under pressure from the autodefensas and the military. The reason Harry was killed, according to unnamed state investigators quoted in the Mexican newspaper Excelsior, was that Los Guerreros believed he was an undercover United States government agent, a young American man riding alone on a motorcycle through one of the most militarized and cartel-controlled states in Mexico, stopping in remote towns, moving slowly, photographing things, speaking fluent Spanish, traveling a route that passed through territory the cartel actively policed. To the eyes of the men watching him, none of that read as innocent tourism. It read as surveillance. The cartel did not ask questions. They took him. Harry's mother, Ann Devert, was not satisfied with the explanation she was given. She told the Washington Post in 2015 that she still had a lot of unanswered questions. She described the whole situation as a vast web of intrigue. She had flown to Mexico during the search, met with local officials, walked through the territory where her son had disappeared, and pushed for answers at every level. Even after the arrest, even after the official explanation, she felt the full truth had not been told. In August 2015, more than a year and a half after Harry vanished, Mexican authorities arrested 2 men in connection with his death. The first was Adrian Reyes Cadena, known as El Tigre, 25 years old, who was described as the leader of Los Guerreros. He was arrested in a resort town in Guerrero and charged with Harry's kidnapping and murder. He was also charged with drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, the 2014 kidnapping of an Italian businessman, and the disappearance of 2 federal Mexican police officers. The second man arrested was Mariano Sierra Santana, described as the leader of another local gang called Los Viagra, an offshoot operating in the same general territory. Sierra was wanted for similar crimes and had allegedly been involved in a 2014 shootout that left 7 people dead. Both men were connected to the fractured cartel landscape of Michoacán and Guerrero after the collapse of the Knights Templar's central structure. They were regional bosses in an area that had become a patchwork of violent local gangs, all competing for the same territory, while the larger cartels fought above them. Harry Devert was 32 years old when he was killed. He had been riding a motorcycle he taught himself to operate 5 months earlier. He had been heading to a beach he had seen in a movie. He had sent one last text message to his girlfriend, telling her about a military escort and a road that had been too dangerous for him to travel. He had no idea what was waiting at the next turn. His blog, A New Yorker Travels, still existed online for years after his death. The final post described buying the motorcycle and his plan to ride it to the bottom of the world. He wrote that he had never ridden before, that he knew people who had gotten seriously hurt on motorcycles, and that he knew a few who had died. He wrote that there was no time like the present. He wrote about life as a pilgrimage. He wrote that he doubted anyone had ever, on their deathbed, regretted chasing a dream. Harry Devert never made it to Zihuatanejo. His remains were found in plastic bags 40 miles from the beach he was trying to reach. El Tigre was arrested, but Harry's mother continued to say, years later, that she still did not know the full story of what happened to her son in those final hours. The Mexican authorities provided a suspect and a motive and closed the case. Anne Devert was left with an official explanation she did not entirely believe, and a grave in a country that had taken her child. Harry's father had died before Harry was killed. Anne Devert lost both of them. She had flown to Mexico alone to walk through cartel territory looking for her son. She had sat across from Mexican governors and attorneys general and demanded answers. She had watched the Facebook page grow to 25,000 followers while she waited for news that turned out to be the worst possible kind. In 2019, on the 5th anniversary of Harry's disappearance, she posted about him again. She had not forgotten. She had not moved on in the way people use that phrase to mean leaving something behind. She remembered him. She kept the memory of who he was alive in the world, because the world had taken everything else. The Guerrero State Attorney's Office listed Harry's case as resolved with the arrest of El Tigre. The federal investigation confirmed organized crime involvement and handed the case back. No trial details are publicly available. No conviction record has been widely reported. A man was arrested. Charges were filed. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts, justice for Harry Devert either happened quietly or did not happen at all. He was a Spanish teacher who learned to ride a motorcycle at 32 because he wanted to see the world before he ran out of time to see it. He disappeared on a Tuesday morning in January in the middle of Mexico and was found in pieces 6 months later. His green Kawasaki was recovered beside him. His camera, his bags, and all his belongings sat untouched in a hotel room in Michoacán for months, waiting for a man who was never coming back to collect them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moved the violence out of remote mountain roads and canyon territory and dropped it directly into one of the most crowded tourist nightclubs on the Mexican Caribbean coast, in front of thousands of people who had come to Mexico to dance. Section 3. The Blue Parrot Nightclub. Shooting. Playa del Carmen, January 16, 2017. Playa del Carmen sits on the Caribbean coast of Mexico, about an hour south of Cancun. In the years leading up to 2017, it had built a reputation as one of the most desirable vacation spots in the world. The beaches were white and clean. The water was the kind of blue that looked fake in photographs but was real when you stood in front of it. The main strip, a pedestrian avenue called Quinta Avenida, was lined with restaurants and bars and shops that stayed open until the early hours of the morning. International tourists came from Europe, Canada, the United States, South America. They came for the sun and the sea and the nightlife. Playa del Carmen was the kind of place people returned to year after year because it felt safe in a way that some other parts of Mexico did not. That feeling was not entirely wrong, and it was not entirely right either. The BPM Music Festival had been running in Playa del Carmen every January since 2008. BPM stood for Beats Per Minute. It was an electronic music festival, 10 days of performances spread across clubs and outdoor venues throughout the town, drawing tens of thousands of people from all over the world. DJs flew in from Europe and North America and played through the night, while crowds danced on beachfront terraces and in open-air clubs. By 2017, BPM had become one of the most well-known events of its kind anywhere in the world. Its 10th edition, running from January 6 through January 15th, had been a success by every measure. The closing night was January 15, running into the early hours of January 16. The main venue for the closing night party was the Blue Parrot nightclub, a beachfront club right off Quinta Avenida that had been a fixture of the Playa del Carmen scene for years. The Blue Parrot was packed. Thousands of people were inside and around the venue. The crowd was overwhelmingly international tourists. Among them were Americans, Canadians, Europeans, and people from dozens of other countries who had traveled specifically for the festival. The music was playing, the night was warm. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, a man walked up to the entrance of the Blue Parrot. Kirk Wilson was working the door. Wilson was Canadian, a security professional who had been brought in as part of the festival's staff. He was doing his job, controlling who came in and who stayed out, managing the flow of people through the single entrance and exit the club had. The man who approached was armed. Wilson moved to stop him. The gunman shot Kirk Wilson dead at the door and walked inside. What followed inside the Blue Parrot in the next few minutes left 5 people dead and 15 others injured. The dead included 4 men and 1 woman. At least one of the people killed was an American. Among those injured, at least 4 were Americans. The woman who died was killed in a fall during the chaos that erupted when the shooting started. The crowd inside the club, thousands of people packed into a space with only one way in and one way out, panicked. People stampeded toward the exit. They climbed over each other. They fell. They screamed. The music kept playing for some period of time before anyone cut it. Outside on the street, people were still running when the shots stopped. A female DJ who had been performing at a separate open-air club called Tribeca, directly across the street from the Blue Parrot, described what she witnessed. She had finished her set and walked over to the Blue Parrot to meet friends. Something felt wrong to her, and she left after only a few minutes, going back to Tribeca. When the shooting started, the staff at Tribeca pulled metal gates closed around the venue. The DJ ran upstairs and looked out of the only window. She saw a man lying dead on the ground. She saw military police and people still pouring out of the Blue Parrot trying to escape. She counted almost 20 bullet casings on the ground in front of Tribeca and told reporters she believed there had been more than one shooter, one inside the club and one working the street outside. Police and military arrived within approximately 10 minutes. It took more than an hour for everyone to get out of the Blue Parrot. The DJ made it back to her hotel, got into the elevator, and collapsed. She told Billboard magazine it was the scariest thing that had ever happened to her in her life. The gunman fled the scene and was not captured that night. By the following day, a cartel had taken public responsibility for the attack. Signs appeared on streets and thoroughfares across Playa del Carmen, spray-painted on large fabric banners, in the style that Mexican cartels use to send public messages. These banners are called narco-mantas. The ones that appeared after the Blue Parrot shooting were signed by a man identified in local media as Rafael del Ángel Vélez Morales, known by the nickname El Fallo Z. He was described as the leader of the local faction of Los Zetas operating in the area. The message on the banners was directed specifically at Philip Pulatano, the Toronto-based co-founder and main organizer of the BPM festival. The message read, in translation, "This is a sign that we are already here, because you did not align. Philip BPM. It is the beginning. We are going to cut the heads of golfos, pelones, and chapulines." The words golfos, pelones, and chapulines referred to rival gangs. The Gulf Cartel, a local group called Los Pelones, and another competing faction. The Zetas were announcing their presence and their control, and they were doing it by name, pointing directly at the man they held responsible for what they saw as a failure to comply. The Quintana Roo State Attorney, Miguel Ángel Pech Sen, said publicly that investigators were pursuing 3 separate lines of inquiry: extortion, drug dealing inside the club, and a targeted killing of one of the Mexican victims. Security camera footage from inside the Blue Parrot showed the gunman moving in a way that suggested he had come specifically to execute one person, a Mexican man from the state of Veracruz. Peck stated on television that the person entered to directly shoot and execute that individual. The extortion angle pointed to the payment structure that had governed how nightlife operated in the Playa del Carmen area for years. Sources with direct knowledge of the situation told CBC News in the days after the shooting that the Zetas cartel had been demanding protection payments from BPM for years. The arrangement had existed since the festival started coming to Playa del Carmen in 2008. Every business operating in the area, bars, clubs, restaurants, event organizers, understood that the cartels expected a cut of the money moving through their territory. A security consultant based in British Columbia, named Walter McKay, who had worked in Mexico for several years, described this to CBC in plain terms. He said that anyone operating in Playa del Carmen had to play by the unofficial rules. If they did not want to have someone show up and shoot the place, they paid. The Zetas had been the dominant force in the state of Quintana Roo, which includes Cancun, Playa del Carmen, and Tulum, for years. Operating a large international event in their territory without their approval was not something that was done without consequences. According to the CBC source, the Zetas had increased their demands on BPM organizers specifically in 2017, and the organizers had ignored those demands. The BPM festival and the Zetas had previously maintained what the source described as a decent relationship. That relationship had broken down. The cartel responded on closing night at 2:30 in the morning, when the club was at maximum capacity and the entire international media would be paying attention to a world-famous music festival. The attack served multiple purposes at once. It punished the festival organizers for non-payment. It sent a message to every other business in Playa del Carmen about what happened when the cartel was ignored, and it demonstrated, in the most public way possible, that the Zetas were present and in control at a moment when rival gangs were pushing into the area. The Gulf Cartel and Los Pelones had been moving into the tourist corridor of the Yucatan Peninsula and fighting the Zetas for the drug market that came with it. Every bar and nightclub and hotel in the area was a revenue source that cartels expected to tax. The BPM Festival, with its international crowd of tens of thousands of affluent tourists, was a particularly valuable prize. Losing it to non-compliance was not acceptable to the Zetas. In the aftermath of the shooting, the manager of a large club on Quinta Avenida spoke to CBC News anonymously. He described the reality that every business owner in Playa del Carmen lived with. He said the cartel had to be taken seriously, that it was not a game. He said you could not simply refuse. You could negotiate. You could tell them to be discreet. You could not keep them out. He expressed hope that the BPM shooting would not scare tourists away permanently. He said this kind of thing did not happen in Playa. He said it was a safe place. He seemed to believe both of those things at the same time, that the cartel was an unavoidable part of operating in the town, and that the town was still safe. For the businesses and local residents who had spent years navigating that reality, those two ideas had somehow become compatible. For the tourists who had come to dance at a music festival and watched a man get shot at the door, the ideas were not compatible at all. 2 days after the shooting, a second attack took place. Gunmen on motorcycles attacked the office of the Quintana Roo State Attorney General, Miguel Ángel Pech Sen, the same man who was leading the investigation into the Blue Parrot massacre. The attackers killed 3 of their own group and 2 local police officers in the assault. Peck survived and appeared on television afterward to reassure the public that authorities were still in control of the security situation. The message from the cartel was obvious. The man investigating the Blue Parrot shooting had been targeted within 48 hours of the attack. Whether the assault on his office was a direct warning to stop the investigation or a broader display of power, the effect was the same. The investigation into who specifically killed Kirk Wilson and the other 4 victims at the Blue Parrot was now operating under direct threat. No one was ever convicted for the Blue Parrot shooting. The festival itself announced during one of the events in that final week in Playa del Carmen that 2017 would be the last year BPM would hold its event in Mexico. The organizers said they would move to Brazil or Portugal. Playa del Carmen's mayor announced that all future electronic music festivals in the city were canceled. The decade-long run of BPM on the Yucatan Peninsula ended in gunfire and blood and a cartel banner with the festival organizer's name spray-painted across it. The broader context of what happened that night at the Blue Parrot, is something the Mexican government had been watching build for years. By 2016, murders in the state of Quintana Roo had already risen to 193 for the year. In 2017, the year of the shooting, that number climbed to 455. By 2018, the annual death toll from cartel violence in Quintana Roo alone reached 840 people. Someone was being killed in that state approximately every 10 hours. This was happening in one of the most visited tourist destinations in the world, in a state whose entire economy rested on making foreigners feel welcome and safe. The specific cartel dynamics driving the violence were straightforward. The Zetas had controlled Quintana Roo for years. But the Zetas were fracturing internally into competing factions while simultaneously fighting the Gulf Cartel and local groups like Los Pelones for control of the drug market along the tourist corridor. Every nightclub and bar that drew wealthy international visitors was also a market for drug sales. Every ounce of cocaine sold to tourists at clubs in Cancun and Playa del Carmen and Tulum was revenue that multiple cartels wanted a piece of. The businesses operating in the area sat at the center of that competition. Pay the right people, stay quiet, let dealers work the crowd, and you were protected. Refuse, or get caught paying the wrong faction, or attract a rival gang's attention, and the consequences could be what happened at the Blue Parrot at 2:30 on a Monday morning. James Graham, an American tourist who had been in Tulum at the time of the shooting, told NBC News that he had come to the area specifically to potentially buy an investment property. He said he and the people he was traveling with had assumed that the cartel violence everyone talked about would not reach the main tourist areas because tourism was too important to the local economy. He said the assumption had been that the cartels would protect the tourist zones because that was how they made money too. The Blue Parrot shooting, he said, made him question whether that assumption had ever been correct. In the days after the attack, American tourists who had been at the festival gave interviews describing the chaos, the screaming, the darkness, and the confusion as people fought to get out through a single exit. Several said they had chosen Playa del Carmen and BPM specifically because it felt safe. Several said they would not return. The broader conversation that followed, about how safe Mexican tourist destinations actually were, about the relationship between cartel violence and the hospitality industry, about what the people running those festivals and clubs actually knew about the conditions they were operating in, did not produce any structural change. The cartels continued to operate in Quintana Roo. The protection payment system continued to function for the businesses that chose to participate in it. The state continued to draw millions of international tourists every year. And the families of the 5 people killed at the Blue Parrot on January 16, 2017, including the family of at least one American, were left to carry the specific grief of having lost someone to violence in a place that had been sold to them as paradise. Kirk Wilson, the Canadian security worker who was shot dead at the door while doing his job, had a name. The American who died inside had a name. The other 3 victims had names. Those names did not drive the international conversation about what happened at BPM, the way the festival itself did. The focus went to the music, the cartel, the warning banners, the cancellations. The people who died were mentioned in articles, and then the articles moved on to the next angle. No one was ever arrested specifically for pulling the trigger inside the Blue Parrot that night. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The gunman walked in, opened fire, and walked out, and 15 years later the case sits unresolved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the cartel's reach out of crowded nightclubs and tourist beaches and moves it deep into the wilderness of the Copper Canyon, where a teacher from North Carolina went hiking into silence and never came back. Section 4. Patrick Braxton Andrew. Copper Canyon, October 28, 2018. Patrick Braxton Andrew was 34 years old and taught algebra and Spanish at a private school in North Carolina. He lived in Davidson, a small college town outside Charlotte, and by every account from the people who knew him, he was exactly the kind of person you would expect to find teaching languages to teenagers. He was warm, He was curious. He spoke Spanish fluently, not just classroom Spanish, but the kind that came from spending real time in the countries where people actually used it. He had traveled widely through Mexico and Central America over the years, moving through the region with the comfort of someone who understood the culture and the language and felt genuinely at home in both. He was also a runner, not a casual jogger, but the kind of person who read books about ultramarathons and thought seriously about what it would feel like to run 50 miles through mountain terrain. He had read Christopher McDougall's book Born to Run, which became one of the most popular running books ever written after it was published in 2009. The book told the story of the Tarahumara people, an indigenous group from the Copper Canyon region of the Mexican state of Chihuahua, who were renowned for their ability to run extraordinary distances through some of the most dramatic landscape on Earth. The book also told the story of the Copper Canyon 50-mile Ultra, a race that took place in and around the town of Urique, a small mining settlement at the bottom of the canyon. The race had drawn runners from around the world who came to compete alongside Tarahumara runners in a place so remote and beautiful that the book had made it famous overnight. Patrick had wanted to go there for years. The Copper Canyon is not one canyon. It is a system of 6 connected canyons in the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains of Chihuahua, and together they are deeper and wider than the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The walls drop thousands of feet. The terrain at the bottom is warm and subtropical, while the rim above sits in pine forest. There are no marked trails. There is almost no signage. The El Chepe train runs along the canyon rim, one of the most scenic rail journeys in the world, passing over bridges and through tunnels cut into the rock face. Tourists ride it specifically for the views. At certain stops, travelers can get off the train and descend to the canyon floor by bus, reaching towns like Urique that sit so far below the rim that they feel cut off from everything above. Patrick took time off from his teaching job in the fall of 2018 and flew to Chihuahua City on October 24th. The next morning, he boarded the El Chepe train and rode it along the canyon rim, watching the landscape change as the train moved through the mountains. On October 26th, he took a bus down from the rim to Urique, the old mining town at the canyon floor. He posted photographs to social media showing the descent. He checked into a small hotel in Urique. He sent a few text messages to friends in the United States from the canyon floor, where cell service was unreliable and came and went depending on where you stood. Those messages were his last communications. He was supposed to meet his brother Kerry in Mexico City on October 30th. He had 4 days. The Copper Canyon 50-mile Ultra, the race that had made Urique famous and that Patrick had read about in Born to Run, had been canceled 2 years earlier. The reason for the cancellation was cartel-related violence in the area. The same remote terrain that made the canyon so dramatic for runners and tourists also made it valuable to drug traffickers who used the mountains and the isolated valleys to move product. The Sinaloa cartel had significant operations in the mountains of Chihuahua. The cancellation of the ultramarathon was not widely reported internationally, and it is not clear whether Patrick knew about it before he traveled. What is clear is that by the time he arrived in Urique in October 2018, the region had been under the influence of organized crime for years, and the town at the bottom of the canyon was not the purely peaceful adventure destination that Born to Run had described. On October 28th, at approximately 4 in the afternoon, Patrick Braxton Andrew left his hotel in Urique and went for a walk. He was spotted by locals walking near a ranch on the outskirts of town. He had not packed a bag. He had not taken his camera. He had not gathered any of his gear. Everything he had brought with him to Mexico was still in his hotel room. This was not a man heading out on a multi-day hike into the wilderness. This was a man going for an afternoon walk near the town where he was staying. He did not come back. When he failed to arrive in Mexico City to meet Kerry on October 30th, his family immediately began retracing his steps. They determined he had last been seen in Urique. They contacted law enforcement on both sides of the border. They created a social media campaign to spread his photograph and ask for information. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, whose office Patrick's family reached out to, made contact with Mexican law enforcement and pushed for action. The search was coordinated, organized, and very public. Within days, thousands of people were following the effort online. Locals in Urique and the surrounding canyon joined the search. Mexican police eventually joined as well, though local residents noted that it took 3 days after Patrick went missing before police became involved in the physical search. The weeks that followed were a study in how little information comes out of places like the Copper Canyon when something goes wrong. The canyon floor is remote. Communication is difficult. Local authorities in areas of Mexico where cartel activity is heavy are often unwilling to share information, either because they genuinely do not have it or because they have reasons not to share it. Patrick's family set up a base in Mexico City and monitored the search from there, passing every piece of information they received back through the social media campaign and to Senator Tillis's office. The Charlotte Observer interviewed the family during the search and described them as exhausted, determined, and running out of leads. The fact that Patrick's belongings were all still in his hotel room had eliminated the theory that he had gone for a hike and gotten lost in the canyon. People who get lost in wilderness do not leave their cameras behind. The canyon below the rim has no marked trails and drops thousands of feet in places, and getting lost there was genuinely possible and genuinely dangerous. But the evidence pointed away from an accident and towards something else entirely. On November 15, 2018, 18 days after Patrick went for his afternoon walk, the Chihuahua state government informed his family of what had happened. Patrick Braxton Andrew had been killed on October 28, 2018, the same day he left his hotel, at the hands of a criminal organization that operated in the area where he was traveling. The criminal organization was the Sinaloa cartel. He had been murdered on the afternoon he walked out the door. The search that had consumed his family, his students, his friends, Senator Tillis's office, thousands of strangers on social media, and local Mexican residents for nearly 3 weeks had been searching for a man who was already gone on the first day. Mexican officials provided no further details. They did not explain how Patrick had crossed paths with the cartel. They did not explain what specifically happened to him. They did not explain why the Sinaloa cartel killed an American schoolteacher who had gone for a walk near a small mining town in a canyon. They confirmed organized crime was responsible and said the search for his body would continue. His body was never found. The family released a statement through the Facebook page they had built during the search. They wrote that Patrick had died doing what he loved, traveling and meeting people. They asked people to join them in celebrating his life the way he would have wanted. They wrote that they would always remember Patrick and his joy for life. They signed it with the nickname his friends used for him, PBA. Carey Braxton Andrew, the brother Patrick had been traveling to meet in Mexico City, had spent the final weeks of the search in Mexico, working alongside his family. He lost both the search and his brother in the same moment. Senator Tom Tillis released a statement saying that Patrick's family deserved justice and that he would continue working with U.S. and Mexican law enforcement to find and repatriate Patrick's remains. Tillis described Patrick as someone who had touched countless lives in Davidson and Mooresville, the communities where he had taught. The governor of Chihuahua issued his own statement, saying he had experienced several hard and sad moments in his role as governor, and that meeting with Patrick's father, Gary Braxton, was among the most difficult. The specific circumstances of Patrick's death were never made public. Why the Sinaloa cartel killed him remains officially unexplained. The most likely explanation, based on what is known about how cartels operate in remote mountain areas, is that Patrick was in the wrong place, walking in a direction the cartel did not want him walking, near something they did not want observed, at a moment when being an unknown outsider in their territory was enough to make him a target. He spoke Spanish fluently, which might have made him seem less like a simple lost tourist and more like someone with a purpose. He was alone. He was in one of the most isolated and cartel-controlled pieces of terrain in Mexico. He left his hotel at 4 in the afternoon and walked toward a ranch on the edge of town. The Copper Canyon 50-mile Ultra, the race that had made Eureka famous and that Patrick had dreamed about, had been shut down because cartel violence made it impossible to hold safely. The town was known to serious trail runners around the world as the setting for one of the great adventure stories in sports. Patrick Braxton Andrew had read that story and felt the pull of the place it described. He was a Spanish teacher, a runner, a traveler who had moved through Latin America many times without incident. He arrived in Urique with the enthusiasm of someone who had wanted to see that specific canyon since he first read about it. He went for a walk one afternoon. The Sinaloa cartel killed him. His body was never recovered. The El Chepe train still runs along the canyon rim. Tourists still ride it for the views. Some still descend to Urique. The Born to Run book that made the canyon famous is still in print and still draws readers who feel the same pull Patrick felt when he first read it. The race has not returned. Patrick Braxton Andrews' case received significant media coverage in the United States in November 2018, driven partly by Senator Tillis's involvement and partly by the social media campaign his family had built during the search. Articles ran in the Washington Post, major regional papers, and national news sites. The coverage was thorough in describing the search and the confirmation of his death. It was almost entirely silent on the question of justice, because there was none to report. No arrests were made. No suspects were publicly identified. No trial took place. The Chihuahua state government confirmed organized crime was responsible, and then, as far as the public record shows, the case went nowhere. 18 days of searching, thousands of people involved. A United States senator pushing two governments for answers, and in the end, a statement that said, "A criminal organization killed him. No body, no suspects, no charges, and no explanation that would ever satisfy a father who flew to Mexico to look for his son." Gary Braxton, Patrick's father, met with the Chihuahua governor on the day the family learned what had happened. The governor said later that meeting with Gary Braxton was one of the hardest things he had experienced in his role. That is the kind of statement that gets made when there is nothing else to offer. No body, no justice, no answers, only confirmation of the worst possible thing, delivered to a father in a foreign country 18 days after his son went for an afternoon walk and never came home. Patrick had told the people in his life that he was heading to meet his brother Kerry in Mexico City. After a few days in the canyon, he had a plan. He had a date. He had a brother waiting for him. He left everything he owned, sitting in a hotel room in Urique, and walked out into an October afternoon in one of the most beautiful and dangerous landscapes in Mexico. The Sinaloa cartel was there. Patrick Braxton Andrew was 34 years old. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves from an individual traveler killed alone in the mountains to the most devastating single attack on American citizens in modern Mexican history, when a cartel ambushed a convoy of mothers and children driving to a family wedding and burned them alive in their cars. Section 5. The LeBaron Langford Family Massacre. Sonora/Chihuahua, November 4th, 2019. The community of La Mora sits in the mountains of Sonora, Mexico, approximately 70 miles south of the Arizona border. It is a small, isolated farming settlement built generations ago by American families who moved to Mexico in the late 1800s and early 1900s and never left. The people who lived there in 2019 were the descendants of those original settlers. They were American citizens, or held dual citizenship between the United States and Mexico, or were born in Mexico to American parents. They spoke English at home. Their children had American names. They had relatives in Arizona, Utah, North Dakota, and across the western United States. They farmed. They raised families. They went to church. They drove American trucks on dirt roads through mountain terrain that looked nothing like anything most Americans had ever seen. The extended LeBaron and Langford families were among the most established in the region. They had been there for generations. Their names were on the land. Their ancestors were buried in the local cemetery. For most of their history in northern Mexico, they had maintained a careful and complicated relationship with the criminal organizations that controlled parts of the surrounding territory. The area sat along smuggling routes that multiple cartels had fought over for years. The families knew this. They had built their lives around it, navigating the reality of living in a place where the rule of law was applied unevenly and where armed men sometimes moved through the hills at night. The LeBaron family, in particular, had a history with cartel violence that predated November 4, 2019, by a decade. In May 2009, a young man named Eric LeBaron had been kidnapped by a cartel and held for ransom. He was released unharmed a week later after his family paid. His older brother, Benjamin LeBaron, 32 years old, responded to the kidnapping by becoming an anti-crime activist. He organized his community. He pushed back publicly against the criminal organizations that had terrorized the region for years. He put his name on his opposition, in a place where doing so was extraordinarily dangerous. 2 months after Eric's release, on July 7, 2009, approximately 15 armed cartel gunmen stormed the LeBaron home at night. They beat Benjamin and his brother-in-law Luis Widmar and shot both of them dead in front of their families. Benjamin LeBaron was 32 years old. Mexican authorities later arrested the alleged leader of the cartel group responsible. The community absorbed that violence and kept living. They had no other choice. La Mora and the surrounding settlements were their home, their land, their whole world. Leaving was not a simple option for people whose roots went down as deep as theirs did. So they stayed. They built their lives. They raised more children. They drove their trucks on the same dirt roads through the same mountains and tried to believe that what had happened to Benjamin was an exception rather than a pattern. 10 years later, the pattern continued. In the days leading up to November 4, 2019, a massive cartel conflict was already underway in the region. The day before the massacre, approximately 100 heavily armed members of La Línea gathered at a ranch in the area. La Línea was the enforcement wing of the Juárez cartel, based in the state of Chihuahua. They had been fighting the Sinaloa cartel for control of smuggling routes, and specifically for control of the area around Agua Prieta, a border town in Sonora. At that meeting, according to court documents filed later in civil proceedings in North Dakota, the order was given to shoot at anyone. Not at cartel rivals specifically, at anyone. Civilian, police officer, anyone who crossed their path as they moved through the territory. The cartel was in offensive mode, conducting an operation to push rivals out of an area they wanted to control, and they had decided that indiscriminate violence was the tool they would use. The next morning, the families of La Mora prepared for a trip. Ronita Miller was 30 years old. She was driving to Phoenix, Arizona, to meet her husband, Howard, who was working in the United States. She had 4 children with her, twin boys named Titus and Tiana, who were 8 months old, and 2 older children. She was driving a Chevrolet Tahoe. Donna Ray Langford was 43 years old. She was heading to a family wedding in Chihuahua State, with 9 of her children inside her Chevrolet Suburban. Her sons Trevor, who was 11 years old, and Rogan, who was 2 years old, were among them. Christina Marie Langford Johnson was 29 years old. She had a 7-month-old daughter named Faith Marie Johnson. Christina was driving a second Chevrolet Suburban. She had placed Faith's car seat on the floor of the vehicle before she set out. The 3 women left La Mora together in a convoy for safety. Traveling in a group was a deliberate choice. They knew the roads could be dangerous. Traveling alone was considered riskier than traveling together. The convoy moved out of the farming community and into the mountains, heading north and east along the roads that connected La Mora to the rest of the region. They had been driving for a while when Ronita Miller's Tahoe developed a flat tire. The convoy stopped. The 2 Suburbans continued ahead while Ronita dealt with the tire. The convoy was now separated, the 3 vehicles in different locations on the same road network through the mountains. What happened next happened in two separate attacks, in two separate locations, carried out by the same group of cartel gunmen. Ronita Miller's Tahoe was the first vehicle hit. The cartel attacked it while she was still dealing with the flat tire. The gunmen opened fire. The Tahoe was shot repeatedly and then set on fire. Ronita Miller and 4 of her children burned to death inside the vehicle. The 8-month-old twins, Titus and Tiana, died in the fire. 3 of her other children were in the vehicle. Some survived. The burnt wreckage sat on the side of a mountain road in Sonora, visible for miles. 9 miles away, the 2 Suburbans, driven by Donna Langford and Christina Johnson, came under gunfire at a second cartel position on the road. The shooting came from above, from men on a hill firing down onto the vehicles. According to family members who later spoke to CNN, bullets rained from above. Christina Langford Johnson stopped her Suburban, got out of the vehicle and raised her hands above her head. She was showing the gunman she was unarmed. She was trying to stop the attack by making clear she posed no threat. The gunman shot her through the chest. She died on the road beside her vehicle. Inside the Suburban, her 7-month-old daughter Faith was in the car seat that Christina had placed on the floor before leaving La Mora. Faith survived. She was found later, unharmed, in that car seat on the floor, protected by her mother's last deliberate act before leaving home that morning. Behind Christina's vehicle, Donna Ray Langford stopped her Suburban and tried to get out to help. The gunman fired at her. She got back in the vehicle and told her children to run. 15 gunmen moved in closer and fired directly into the Suburban. Donna Ray Langford was killed. 2 of her children, Trevor, 11 years old, and Rogan, 2 years old, were shot and killed with her. The other children in the vehicle were wounded. According to the account that emerged later from the survivors, once the firing stopped, the cartel men came down from the hill and approached the vehicles. They looked at the surviving children, most of them wounded, and told them to get out and go. The children started walking. 13-year-old Devin Langford had watched his mother and 2 brothers die. He was uninjured. He gathered the surviving children from the vehicle, counted them, assessed who was hurt and how badly, and made a decision. He took 6 of his siblings into the bushes alongside the road, hidden in the scrub and the dirt, and covered them with branches to keep them out of sight while he went for help. He was 13 years old. He walked approximately 14 miles through the mountains alone to reach the community of La Mora and alert adults to what had happened. While Devin was walking, 9-year-old Mackenzie Langford was waiting in the bushes with the others. Mackenzie had been shot in the wrist. She waited for Devin to come back. When he did not return quickly enough, she made her own decision. She told the others she was going to find him. She had a bullet wound in her wrist, and she had been sitting in the dark in the mountains after watching her mother die, and she stood up and started walking in the dark to find her brother. She walked approximately 10 miles alone before search parties found her. Her first words when she saw her uncles were not about herself. She told them they had to go back. She said her brothers and sisters were dying in the bushes and were bleeding, and they had to go rescue them. The survivors were eventually found. 5 of the most seriously injured children were transported to a hospital in Tucson, Arizona, with help from the Mexican military. 2 others were able to be treated locally. The babies who survived needed extensive medical care. 9 people died in total on November 4, 2019. 3 women and 6 children. All of them held American citizenship, either solely American or dual American-Mexican. The youngest were the 8-month-old twins, who burned in the Tahoe with their mother. Faith Marie Johnson, 7 months old, survived because her mother put her car seat on the floor before leaving La Mora that morning. The response from the United States was immediate and loud. President Donald Trump offered Mexico military support to help destroy the cartels. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador declined the offer but agreed to discuss security cooperation. Trump posted on social media that a wonderful family and friends had been caught between 2 vicious cartels and called for war against the monsters responsible. López Obrador rejected the language of war, saying that war was irrational and that politics had been invented to avoid it. Mexican authorities said publicly that the attack appeared to be a case of mistaken identity. The official position was that the cartel had believed the convoy was a rival cartel group and attacked on that basis. A senior Mexican general told the Wall Street Journal he believed La Línea had sent gunmen to the area to stop the Sinaloa cartel from expanding its territory, not to specifically target the American families. Family members disputed this. Julian LeBaron, a cousin of the victims, pointed out that in the second attack, one of the women had tried to identify herself to the gunmen with her hands raised, and they shot her anyway. He said there could be no mistaken identity when a woman stood in the road with her hands up and was shot through the chest. He told the New York Times that it was common knowledge in that area that the police worked with the criminals, and that the cartels had a monopoly on security in the region. Nearly 30 suspects were arrested by Mexican authorities in the weeks and months following the massacre. In December 2019, the Mexican federal government consolidated all the separate state and local investigations into a single federal case. One of the men arrested, identified as Alfredo L., was described as a likely participant in the events of November 4. The director of public safety in the municipality of Llanos, Chihuahua, named Fidel Alejandro Villegas, was arrested on December 24, 2019, on charges that he had provided protection for La Línea and colluded in the massacre. The investigation continued for years. In September 2023, a suspect named Gustavo Hernandez Cabral was arrested in New Mexico in the United States on charges connected to the attack. In June 2022, a federal court in North Dakota, where Howard Miller and Tyler Johnson, the husbands of two of the women killed, had been living and working, held a 4-day civil trial against the Juarez cartel and La Línea under the Federal Anti-Terrorism Act. The cartel had no representation at the trial. They did not respond to the legal summons. The judge awarded the families of the 9 victims $4.64 billion in damages. The ruling stated that the massacre on November 4, 2019, constituted an act of terrorism. The law firm representing the families, Motley Rice, subsequently filed more than 1,200 separate claims against assets seized from drug traffickers in U.S. law enforcement operations, working to convert the symbolic judgment into actual money that could reach the families. In January 2025, a federal judge in Mexico ordered the Attorney General's office to investigate the massacre as an act of terrorism under Mexican law as well. The community of La Mora still exists. The families who survived are still there, or have moved to the United States, or exist in the complicated space between both countries that dual citizens occupy. The cemetery in La Mora holds the graves of Donna Ray Langford, her sons Trevor and Rogan, and the others killed that day. Funerals were held on November 7, 2019, 3 days after the attack, attended by hundreds of people, some of whom had traveled from as far as North Dakota to be there. Julian LeBaron, the family member who had been most outspoken in the aftermath, had already lived through the murder of his brother Benjamin 10 years earlier. He had watched his family try to organize against cartel violence in 2009 and seen Benjamin shot dead for it. He had spent a decade watching the threat grow while living within it. After November 4, 2019, he continued to speak. He told the New York Times what everyone in La Mora had known for years, that the police worked with the criminals, that the cartels had a monopoly on security, that the people who lived in those mountains had been paying that price for a long time. 9 people were killed, 3 women, including a 29-year-old who put her baby's car seat on the floor before she left home, and a 30-year-old whose 8-month-old twins burned with her in her car. 6 children, the youngest 8 months old, the oldest 11. A 13-year-old boy hid his siblings in bushes and walked 14 miles alone through the mountains to get help. A 9-year-old girl with a bullet in her wrist walked 10 miles in the dark, asking about her brothers and sisters. The $4.64 billion judgment against the Juarez cartel remains largely uncollected. The cartel did not attend the trial. They did not pay. The lawyers are working through seized assets one claim at a time. The families are waiting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the LeBaron Langford massacre was an ambush in open mountain country far from any tourist zone, the next case shows how cartel violence found its way into the most popular beach destination in Mexico, in the middle of a crowded restaurant, while tourists sat eating dinner and had no idea what was about to happen at the table next to them. Section 6. Anjali Riot, Tulum, October 20th, 2021. Tulum sits on the Caribbean coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, about 90 miles south of Cancun. For most of its modern history as a tourist destination, it occupied a specific place in the imagination of international travelers. It was the alternative, the quieter option, the place people chose when they wanted the turquoise water and white sand of the Mexican Caribbean, without the massive resort hotels and spring break crowds of Cancun. Tulum had cenotes, which are natural freshwater pools connected to underground cave systems that run beneath the entire Yucatan Peninsula. It had Mayan ruins, sitting on a cliff above the sea. It had small boutique hotels, built from wood and stone along a strip of beach road. It had restaurants where you ate with your feet near the sand and watched the sun go down over the water. It had a reputation, carefully cultivated and widely believed, as a place where the problems that affected other parts of Mexico had not yet arrived. That reputation had been built over years, and it had never been entirely accurate. The same geography that made Tulum attractive to tourists made it attractive to the cartels who had been expanding south from Cancun and Playa del Carmen for years. The state of Quintana Roo, which contains Cancun, Playa del Carmen, Cozumel, and Tulum, had been cartel territory for a long time. The Zetas had operated in Cancun and Playa del Carmen for years, demanding protection payments from businesses and controlling the drug market that ran through the tourist corridor. As the Zetas began to fracture and weaken internally, other groups moved in. The Gulf Cartel pushed into the area. Local gangs affiliated with larger organizations emerged and fought for the specific revenue streams that came with controlling a beach town full of wealthy international tourists. By 2021, the Tulum that existed in travel magazines and social media posts and the Tulum that existed in reality had become two very different places. Anjali Riot had built her life around showing people the world. She was born in Himachal Pradesh, in northern India, and had moved to California, settling in San Jose. She was a travel blogger, running an Instagram account and a Facebook page that documented her journeys to beautiful places. Her Instagram showed her lounging on a seaside pier in Tulum, smiling, the water behind her. That photograph had been posted 2 days before she was killed. It was the last image she shared with the world, a picture of herself in the place where she was about to die, looking happy in the afternoon light. She had come to Tulum in October 2021, the way hundreds of thousands of travelers came to Tulum every year. She came because it was beautiful, because the photographs she had seen made it look like exactly the kind of place a travel blogger should visit and document and share. She came because Tulum's reputation as a safe and tranquil destination was still largely intact in the public imagination, even as the reality on the ground had been deteriorating for years. On the evening of October 20th, 2021, Anjali was dining at an outdoor restaurant on a small street in Tulum's main commercial zone, known locally as the Mini Quinta. The name was a reference to Quinta Avenida, the famous pedestrian strip in Playa del Carmen, and the Mini Quinta was Tulum's version of it, a stretch of bars and restaurants and shops that drew tourists every night of the week. The tables at the restaurant where Anjali sat extended onto the street, open to the warm evening air, the way outdoor dining works throughout the Mexican Caribbean. She was there with other people. The restaurant was busy. It was a normal Wednesday night in a popular tourist town. A gunfight broke out between two rival groups who were fighting over drug sales in the area. Anjali Riot was shot and killed in the crossfire. She was 35 years old. A German tourist named Jennifer Hensoldt was also shot and killed in the same attack. 3 other foreign tourists sitting in the restaurant were wounded. The Quintana Roo state prosecutors who investigated the shooting described what had happened in straightforward terms. Two groups involved in street-level drug dealing in the Tulum tourist area had gotten into a violent confrontation. The tourists eating at the outdoor restaurant had been caught in the middle of it. The prosecutors said the victims may have been caught in the crossfire, phrasing that made the randomness of what happened clear. Anjali Riot and Jennifer Henzold had not been targeted. They had been sitting at a restaurant table on a street where two drug gangs decided to shoot at each other that night. The specific gang identified as responsible for the shooting was Los Pelones, which translates roughly as the Shaved Heads. Los Pelones was affiliated with the Gulf Cartel and had been expanding its operations south from Cancun and Playa del Carmen into Tulum over the preceding years. The group had for a long time been extorting protection payments from bars and nightclubs in Cancun. As it moved further south into the Mayan Riviera corridor, it brought those same operations with it. Businesses in Tulum were expected to pay. Rival drug dealers who tried to operate in areas Los Pelones considered their territory were dealt with violently. In the days after the shooting, handwritten signs appeared around Tulum, posted at a local market. The signs were signed by Los Pelones. The message on the signs was directed at the bars and restaurants of the Mini Quinta area. It read, in translation, "This was a warning, so you can see we mean business." The signs added that businesses either got in line or the gang would continue shutting places down, the way it had shut down the Mini Quinta that night. The final line was the clearest statement of all. "We are in control here." A cartel had just killed two international tourists at a restaurant table and followed it up by posting signs around town, telling the local business community that this was what happened when they did not comply. The signs were not hidden. They were put up in a public market where locals and tourists could read them. The message was meant to be seen. The shooting destroyed something that had taken years to build, not the physical restaurant, which could reopen. The idea of Tulum as a place apart, as the quiet and safe alternative to the flashier and more dangerous spots up the coast. That idea had always been more marketing than reality, but it had functioned because the violence had stayed mostly out of the central tourist areas. When two men were shot dead on the beach in Tulum in June 2021, 4 months before the restaurant attack, it had generated concern, but had not fundamentally changed how the town was perceived internationally. The October shooting, with its dead tourists and its cartel signs and its explicit territorial message, was harder to absorb into a reassuring narrative. An American tourist named James Graham had traveled to Tulum specifically to look at investment properties. He had been considering buying something he could rent out on a short-term basis, the kind of investment that the Tulum real estate market had been aggressively promoting to foreign buyers for years. After the shooting, he told NBC News that he and the people traveling with him had assumed that cartel violence would not reach the main tourist areas because the cartels themselves depended on tourism revenue and therefore had a reason to keep tourists safe. He said the assumption had been that the economic logic of the situation provided a kind of protection. The October shooting made him question whether that assumption had ever been valid. He said he and his group were no longer sure they were going to buy anything in Tulum. His assumption was one that a lot of people had made. The idea was simple. The cartels needed the tourists to keep coming because the tourism economy was too important to their own revenue streams, both legal and illegal, to risk destroying. Hotels, restaurants, clubs, and bars all paid protection. Tourists brought money that flowed through all of those businesses. Killing tourists was bad for the cartel's bottom line. Therefore, tourists were, in a rough and brutal way, protected by the cartel's own financial interests. That logic had worked up to a point, but it had always depended on cartel discipline and organizational control, on leaders who understood the long-term value of maintaining the appearance of safety in tourist zones and could enforce that understanding on the men working beneath them. As the cartels in Quintana Roo fragmented, as newer and less disciplined factions fought for territory at the street level, the calculus changed. Los Pelones shooting up a restaurant on the Mini Quinta in Tulum did not reflect the strategic thinking of a cartel leadership weighing long-term tourism revenue against short-term territorial enforcement. It reflected the decision of a street-level gang faction that wanted to establish dominance in a specific area, on a specific night, and did not factor in the tourists sitting at the outdoor tables when they started shooting. Mexico's Defense Secretary Luis Crescencio Sandoval announced a plan to increase the military and police presence in Tulum and the broader Mayan Riviera in the days after the shooting. More troops were deployed to the area. Roadblocks were set up on the beach road. Uniformed personnel became more visible in the tourist zones. The Mexican government understood that the international attention generated by the deaths of 2 foreign tourists at a restaurant table threatened the tourism economy of the entire state. The deployment of additional forces did not result in any reported convictions for the killing of Anjali Riot or Jennifer Hensoldt. The men who fired the shots that killed them were sought, according to prosecutors. But no public record of arrests or charges directly connected to the October 20, 2021 shooting has emerged in the years since. What the October shooting did was change the conversation about Tulum in ways that persisted long after the additional troops were deployed. Travel publications that had been running enthusiastic pieces about Tulum for years began adding safety warnings. The State Department's travel advisory for Quintana Roo remained at elevated levels. Social media influencers and travel bloggers, who had been among the loudest promoters of Tulum, began including caveats in their posts. Some stopped going. The investment inquiry that James Graham had been making quietly disappeared from his plans. Anjali Riot's Instagram page remained active after her death, a record of the places she had traveled and the images she had built her platform on. The last photograph she posted, the one showing her smiling on a pier in Tulum 2 days before she was killed, continued to exist in that strange space that social media occupies after someone dies, visible and permanent, and entirely disconnected from what happened next. People who followed her left comments on her posts after the news broke. They wrote about her warmth and her love of travel. They wrote that she had been doing what she loved in a place she had chosen to be. They wrote the things people write when someone dies somewhere beautiful and violent, and the death makes no sense at all. Jennifer Hensoldt, the German tourist killed in the same attack, was identified by name but received significantly less coverage in English-language media. Her hometown was not immediately available to reporters covering the shooting. She was described in most articles as a German woman, a tourist, someone passing through the same restaurant on the same night. She had a name and a life, and people who loved her, and she died at a table in Tulum because 2 gangs decided to shoot at each other on the street outside. The restaurant where the shooting happened was cordoned off with police tape the next morning. Photographs taken by local media showed the tape across the entrance, the plastic chairs and the outdoor tables visible behind it. Ordinary furniture in an ordinary tourist restaurant that had become a crime scene while people were eating dinner. Tulum in 2021 was 6 years away from having an international airport, which the Mexican government was building partly to reduce the dependence on the Cancun airport and partly to further develop Tulum as a high-end destination. The airport opened in December 2023. The Maya train, a major infrastructure project that ran a loop around the Yucatan Peninsula with a stop in Tulum, was also under construction. The Mexican government was investing billions of dollars in turning Tulum into an even more significant international destination. The October 2021 shooting sat awkwardly inside that ambition, an episode that the official narrative of a booming, modern, investment-worthy Tulum needed to process and move past as quickly as possible. Los Pelones continued to operate in Tulum after the shooting. The Gulf Cartel and its affiliated groups continued to fight for territory in the Mayan Riviera corridor. The protection payment system that governed how nightlife and tourism businesses operated in the area continued to function. The signs that Los Pelones had posted at the local market after the shooting had made the terms of that system explicit for anyone who had somehow missed the reality of how things worked. "We are in control here. Get in line, or we will continue shutting places down." Anjali Riot had come to Tulum to take photographs and write about a beautiful place for the audience she had built on social media. She was 35 years old. She had spent years traveling the world and documenting what she found. The last place she documented was the one that killed her, at a table at an outdoor restaurant on a warm October evening, while a gang war played out in the street 20 feet away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves north from Tulum to the border between Texas and Mexico, where 4 friends from South Carolina drove across into a city so dangerous the U.S. State Department had already told Americans not to go there, and walked directly into a cartel ambush that left 2 of them dead and the other 2 hiding under the bodies of their friends. Section 7. Shaeed Woodard and Zindell Brown, Matamoros, March 3, 2023. Matamoros sits directly across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas. You can stand on the American side and see the Mexican city. The 2 places are connected by international bridges that tens of thousands of people cross every week, going back and forth between 2 countries that share a border, a river, and an economy that flows in both directions. People cross to visit family. They cross to buy medication. They cross to see doctors, to shop, to eat, to work. The crossing is routine for many people who live in that part of Texas and Tamaulipas. It has been routine for generations. Matamoros in 2023 was also one of the most dangerous cities on the entire United States-Mexico border. The Gulf Cartel had controlled Tamaulipas state for years, and Matamoros was one of its primary strongholds. But the Gulf Cartel in 2023 was no longer a single unified organization. It had fractured into competing factions that fought each other for territory, revenue, and control of the smuggling routes that ran through the city and across the river into Texas. 2 of the most powerful factions operating in Matamoros at that time were known as the Metros and the Scorpions. The Scorpions, formerly called Grupo Escorpión, controlled significant parts of the city. The fighting between these factions produced a level of street violence that made Matamoros one of the most consistently deadly cities in a state the U.S. State Department had already placed on its highest level of travel warning. The warning for Tamaulipas told American citizens plainly, "Do not travel there." It listed the specific dangers: organized crime activity, gun battles, armed robbery, kidnapping. It stated that criminal groups regularly targeted both public and private vehicles, including passenger buses, and often took passengers at gunpoint and demanded ransom. The warning had been in place. It was publicly available. Anyone planning to travel to Matamoros in March 2023 could have read it before they left. Latavia Washington McGee was from Lake City, South Carolina. She was in her 30s, and she needed a medical procedure. The procedure she needed was a tummy tuck, a cosmetic surgery that would have cost significantly more in the United States than it would across the border in Mexico. Medical tourism was a well-established and widely used practice for Americans living near the border, and for many Americans who were willing to travel further for the cost savings. Nearly 1 million Americans crossed into Mexico for medical care every year, according to figures from the Mexican Council for Medical Tourism. The quality of care at reputable clinics was generally considered comparable to American standards. The cost difference was real and significant. Latavia had arranged her appointment in Matamoros. She asked 3 of her closest friends to go with her. She and the 3 men she asked had grown up together in and around Lake City, South Carolina. They had been friends for most of their lives. Eric James Williams was going to make sure she got there and back safely. Shaeed Woodard, 33 years old, came because Latavia was his friend, and she had asked him to come with her. His last conversation with her before the trip, as she later recalled it, was him telling her he was her brother and he was supposed to be there for her. Zindell Brown, who was in his mid-20s, came for the same reason. A 5th person had been traveling with the group, but got out of the vehicle before they reached the border crossing, because they did not have the documentation needed to enter Mexico. The 4 friends traveled to Brownsville in a white minivan with North Carolina license plates. On the morning of Friday, March 3, 2023, They drove across the international bridge from Brownsville into Matamoros. The crossing was uneventful. They were in Mexico. Within minutes of entering Matamoros, the minivan was ambushed. Surveillance camera footage captured what happened next and was widely shared after the attack. Armed men wearing tactical vests and carrying assault rifles arrived in another vehicle and surrounded the minivan. The minivan and another vehicle appear to have collided at the scene. Almost immediately, the gunmen moved in. They opened fire on the minivan. At least one bullet hole punched through the driver's side window. The gunmen then pulled the 4 Americans out of the vehicle. Video showed a gunman dragging at least one person across the ground and throwing them into the back of a white pickup truck. 2 of the Americans appeared motionless as they were loaded into the truck. Terrified Mexican civilians in nearby vehicles sat completely still in their cars, not moving, not getting out, not drawing any attention to themselves. They had seen enough of Matamoros to know what you did when the cartel was operating in the street in front of you. You sat still and you did not move. The pickup truck drove away with 4 Americans inside it. A Mexican woman named Arely Pablo Servando, 33 years old, a working mother who had been nearby when the shooting started, was struck by a stray bullet and killed. She had nothing to do with any of it. She was in the wrong place, and a bullet that was not meant for her ended her life. For the next 4 days, Mexican and American authorities searched Matamoros. The Tamaulipas state governor, Americo Villarreal, said publicly that the cartel moved the kidnapped victims around the city multiple times during those 4 days, specifically to create confusion and make rescue efforts harder. They were taken to a medical clinic at some point where they received some form of treatment. Then they were moved again. The cartel knew the city and its roads and its buildings the way an army knows the terrain of its own territory. The victims were moved through it methodically. On the morning of March 7, 4 days after the abduction, 5 men with their hands tied were found abandoned near the location of the original attack in downtown Matamoros. A handwritten letter accompanied them, placed on the windshield of a pickup truck near where the men were left. The letter claimed to be from Grupo Escorpión, the Scorpions faction of the Gulf Cartel. It stated that the men being handed over were the ones directly responsible for the attack, that they had acted under their own decision-making and without authorization, going against the rules under which the Gulf Cartel operated. The letter expressed condolences to the families on both sides of the border and to the people of Matamoros. It said those responsible would face consequences regardless of who they were. The same morning, Mexican authorities located all 4 Americans inside a wooden house on the outskirts of Matamoros. Shahid Woodard was dead. Zindell Brown was dead. Latavia Washington McGee was alive and injured. Eric James Williams was alive and injured. The 2 survivors were taken by ambulance to an international bridge and transported to Valley Regional Medical Center in Brownsville, Texas, with an FBI escort. Eric Williams later gave an interview in which he described lying on the floor of the pickup truck during the abduction, covered by the bodies of Shahid Woodard and Zindell Brown, hidden beneath the dead bodies of 2 of his closest friends. He lay still and stayed hidden and survived. Latavia Washington McGee gave an interview to CNN's Anderson Cooper more than a month after the attack. She described speaking to Zindell Brown while he was dying. The kidnappers had told the group they were taking Zindell to a hospital. They came back approximately an hour later. He was dead. Latavia said she had spoken to him the entire time. She told him she was sorry because she had been the one who asked him to come with her. She recalled his response. He had told her it was okay, that he was her brother, that he was supposed to be there for her, that he loved her. Those were among the last things Zindell Brown said before the cartel took him away. She said he did not deserve what happened. She said none of them deserved it. Shahid Woodard's family was in Florence, South Carolina. His cousin Aliyah McLeod was among the first family members to publicly identify him after the attack. Zindell Brown's sister, Zalandria Brown, told the Associated Press that her younger brother had been one of the 4 victims, confirming his identity to the press, while his body was still in a Mexican morgue. The remains of Shaeed Woodard and Zindell Brown were handed over to U.S. diplomatic authorities in Brownsville on Thursday, March 9th, 6 days after they were killed. They were transported to a funeral home in Brownsville before being returned to South Carolina. The 5 men the Gulf Cartel handed over were subsequently charged by the Tamaulipas Attorney General's office with aggravated kidnapping and homicide. A 24-year-old man from Tamaulipas State, identified only as Jose N., had already been arrested separately on an aggravated kidnapping charge after he was found guarding the victims at the wooden house. In January 2024, Mexican Marines arrested a man identified as Jose Alberto Garcia Villano, known by the nickname La Quena, who was described as one of the key leaders of the Gulf Cartel in Tamaulipas and one of the main targets of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. His arrest was linked to the broader investigation into the cartel faction responsible for the March 30 attack. The question of why Matamoros had been chosen as the destination for Latavia's medical procedure was one that received significant attention in the days after the attack. The U.S. State Department's do not travel warning for Tamaulipas had been in place. Matamoros specifically had a documented history of cartel violence, kidnapping, and attacks on vehicles crossing into the city. Security experts who were interviewed after the attack noted that Americans seeking medical care in Mexico had learned over time to take specific precautions in dangerous border cities, registering vehicles in Mexico to get local license plates, avoiding walking around on foot, using only established and recommended clinics. The 4 friends from South Carolina had driven a white minivan with North Carolina license plates into one of the most cartel-controlled cities on the border. The vehicle immediately identified them as Americans who had just crossed over. U.S. investigators believed the Gulf Cartel had mistaken the group for Haitian drug smugglers operating in the Matamoros area. The cartel had been using the same border crossing points that medical tourists used, and the faction watching the crossing that morning had flagged the minivan as suspicious. The Mexican government's official position, stated by President López Obrador, was that the 4 Americans had been caught in crossfire between 2 armed groups after entering the city, and that they had been going to buy medicine. A government-sponsored fact-checking organization in Mexico publicly disputed the claims that the group had been mistaken for Haitian drug traffickers, calling reports of that specific identification false. The 2 governments were operating with different accounts of the same event, and neither account changed the outcome for Shaeed Woodard and Zindell Brown. The political response in the United States was significant and immediate. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, the home state of all 4 victims, called on the United States to formally designate Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and stated that if the Mexican government would not destroy the cartels, the United States military should intervene to do it. Other members of Congress introduced legislation along similar lines. The kidnapping pushed the cartel designation debate, which had been ongoing for years, back to the front of the political agenda. President López Obrador responded by describing any form of U.S. military involvement in Mexico as an offense to the Mexican people, and threatened to launch an information campaign directed at Mexicans and Latinos living in the United States. The Texas Department of Public Safety, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, urged all Texans to refrain from traveling anywhere in Mexico during the upcoming spring break because of ongoing cartel violence. The Gulf Cartel's public apology letter and their act of handing over 5 bound members to the police was noted by American law enforcement officials who were familiar with how Mexican cartels operated. The letter and the gesture were understood as a form of public relations management. Cartels in northeastern Mexico had a history of releasing written communications to manage situations that had drawn too much attention. The killing of American citizens drew federal involvement from both governments, generated international media coverage, and threatened the cartel's ability to operate without the kind of scrutiny that made business harder. Handing over 5 lower-level members and issuing an apology was a way of saying the problem had been addressed internally, the responsible parties had been punished, and normal operations could continue. American investigators strongly doubted the sincerity of the gesture, according to officials who spoke to CNN at the time. Latavia Washington McGee had wanted to have a cosmetic surgery that she could not afford at American prices. She had asked her 3 closest friends to go with her. One of those friends had told her he was her brother and he was supposed to be there for her. He was killed 4 days after they crossed the bridge. The friend who had said he loved her and asked her not to worry came back in a body bag while she was still alive in a wooden house on the outskirts of the city. Shaeed Woodard was 33 years old. Zindell Brown was in his mid-20s. They had grown up in Lake City, South Carolina, a small town of about 6,000 people. They had been friends with Latavia and Eric for most of their lives. They drove to Brownsville in a white minivan to help a friend get to a doctor's appointment. They crossed a bridge into Mexico on a Friday morning, and they never came home. 6 people were arrested in connection with the attack. None of the senior Gulf Cartel leadership responsible for operating the Scorpions faction in Matamoros has been fully prosecuted for the deaths of Shaeed Woodard and Zindell Brown. The case remains active in both Mexican and American legal systems. The 2 survivors, Latavia McGee and Eric Williams, were still recovering from their physical and psychological injuries months after the attack. In the April 2023 interview, Latavia said they were alive and they had a lot of recovering to do. She said she still could not fully process what had happened in those 4 days. Eric Williams, who had hidden under the bodies of his dead friends in the back of a cartel pickup truck, said very little publicly about what the experience had been like. He did not need to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the Matamoros attack was carried out by a cartel that knew the group it was targeting was foreign, the next case shows what happens when an American is killed as pure collateral damage, sitting at a beach resort in Mexico during a drug transaction that had nothing to do with her, in a town that had already killed tourists before and was about to do it again. Section 8. Nico Honor-Baksh, Tulum, February 9, 2024. Tulum had been through this before. In October 2021, Anjali Riot had been shot and killed at an outdoor restaurant table while 2 rival drug gangs fired at each other on the street. A German tourist had died in the same attack. 3 others had been wounded. The Mexican government had deployed additional military forces to the area. The state attorney's office had opened an investigation. Officials had made statements about restoring safety and security to the Mayan Riviera corridor. Tulum's mayor and regional tourism authorities had worked to reassure the international travel community that the violence was an isolated incident, that it had been addressed, that the town was safe. 2 years and 4 months later, an American woman was shot dead in Tulum in almost identical circumstances. Nico Honor-Baksh was 44 years old and lived in Los Angeles, California. She had traveled to Tulum in February 2024, the kind of trip that tens of thousands of Americans made to the Mexican Caribbean every winter, escaping the cold and seeking the warmth and the water that Tulum had built its international reputation on. She was there as a tourist. She was doing what tourists in Tulum did. She was in one of the most visited beach destinations in the Western Hemisphere, in a town that had an international airport under construction, a major train line being built to connect it to the rest of the Yucatan Peninsula, and billions of dollars in investment flowing through its real estate and hospitality sectors. On February 9, 2024, Nico Honor-Baksh was killed in the crossfire of what prosecutors described as a drug deal that turned violent. A man from Belize was also killed in the same incident. When investigators arrived at the scene, the Belizean man was found with cocaine on his person, along with transparent bags containing red and orange pills and bags containing brown granulated powder. The Quintana Roo State Attorney General's office determined, based on this physical evidence, that the man had been a drug dealer and was likely part of a criminal gang. The conclusion investigators drew was that a transaction involving that man had gone wrong and that a shooting had followed, and that Nico Honor-Baksh had been caught in the middle of it. Local media reports in the immediate aftermath of the shooting attempted to link Nico Honerbach to the Belizean man, suggesting they had known each other or had been together at the time. The Quintana Roo State Attorney General's office directly and publicly contradicted this. Prosecutors released a photograph showing the Belizean man with a completely different woman, establishing that he and Nico Honerbach had no documented connection. The official investigative position was that she had been in the vicinity of a drug-related shooting and had been struck. She was not involved in anything criminal. She was a 44-year-old woman from Los Angeles who was in the wrong place at the exact wrong moment. Prosecutors stated that suspects in the shooting had been identified and were being actively sought. The circumstances of Nico Honerbach's death sat inside a pattern that had been building in Tulum for years, a pattern that the deployment of soldiers and the statements of officials after the 2021 restaurant shooting had not broken. The underlying dynamics that produced cartel violence in the tourist zones of the Yucatan Peninsula had not changed because more uniformed personnel walked the beach road. The cartels had not withdrawn. The drug market that ran through the clubs and restaurants and open-air venues of Tulum had not dried up because of increased military presence. The territorial conflicts between competing gangs had not resolved. Everything that had been true in October 2021, when Anjali Riot was shot, was still true in February 2024, when Nico Honerbach was shot. The soldiers were there, the cartels were also there, and the tourists were there between them. To understand how Nico Honerbach died, it is necessary to understand what Tulum had actually become by 2024 and how it had gotten there. The transformation of Tulum from a quiet backpacker destination into one of the most visited and commercially developed beach towns in the world had happened fast, compressed into roughly a decade. In the early 2010s, Tulum was genuinely low-key. The hotels on the beach road were small, the restaurants were simple, the crowd was a mix of budget travelers, yoga practitioners, and people who specifically wanted to be somewhere that did not feel like a resort. The cenotes drew snorkelers and cave divers. The Mayan ruins on the cliff above the sea drew history travelers. The overall vibe was relaxed and unhurried. Then the social media era found it. Instagram made Tulum famous in a way that no travel magazine article could have. The photographs were extraordinary. The turquoise water, the white sand, the ruins against the sky, the cenotes with their shafts of light falling through water so clear you could see everything beneath the surface. Boutique hotels began to multiply along the beach road, each one designed with photography in mind, built to produce the images that would bring the next wave of guests. Restaurants opened with aesthetics as carefully considered as their menus. Wellness retreats and yoga studios multiplied. The crowd changed from budget backpackers to people with significantly more money to spend. Real estate prices climbed. International investors bought land and built properties. Airlines added direct routes. The Mexican government announced an international airport and a train stop, committing the full weight of federal infrastructure investment to Tulum's future as a high-end destination. All of that development happened in territory where the cartels were already operating, had been operating for years, and had no intention of vacating. The drug market that ran through Tulum's nightlife and hospitality scene was valuable precisely because of the same demographic shift that had made Tulum attractive to investors. Wealthy international tourists with money to spend were also customers for the cocaine and other drugs that the cartels moved through the clubs and beach parties and private villa events that defined Tulum's nightlife economy. Every new venue that opened brought a new revenue stream. Every festival or event that drew thousands of affluent visitors from Europe and North America was also an opportunity. The businesses operating in Tulum navigated the same protection payment system that governed every tourist town along the Yucatan corridor. The cartels that controlled the area expected their cut of what moved through it. By 2024, the Gulf Cartel's affiliated groups, including Los Pelones, which had claimed responsibility for the 2021 restaurant shooting, were still active in the area. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel had also been pushing into the Yucatan corridor, fighting Gulf-affiliated groups for control of the territory. The fragmentation of cartel control that had characterized the region since the Zetas began breaking up years earlier had continued. Multiple competing groups, all of them willing to use violence, all of them fighting over the same territory and the same revenue streams, operated in and around a town that was simultaneously being promoted globally as one of the most desirable vacation destinations in the world. The gap between those two realities, the promotional Tulum and the actual Tulum, had consequences that fell most heavily on people who had been given no accurate picture of where they were going. The U.S. State Department's travel advisory for Quintana Roo, the state that contains Tulum, sat at Level 2 in the period around Nico Honorbakhsh's death. Level 2 means exercise increased caution. The advisory noted that travelers should be aware of their surroundings at all times and that criminal activity and violence could occur anywhere in the state. It stopped short of the Do Not Travel designation that covered states like Tamaulipas, where the Matamoros kidnappings had taken place. A Level 2 advisory for a state the size of Quintana Roo, which contains Cancun and Cozumel and the entire Mayan Riviera, was easy to read as a general caution rather than a specific warning. It did not say, "Stay away from Tulum." It said, "Be aware." Being aware had not helped Anjali Riot in 2021. Being aware did not help Nico Honorbakhsh in 2024. Both women were killed in incidents that gave no warning and no time to react. A drug deal going wrong on a street or in an outdoor space near where tourists gathered was not something situational awareness could protect against. You could not see it coming. You could not move away from it. By the time the shooting started, the decision about where to stand had already been made. The Quintana Roo Attorney General's office said investigators had identified suspects in the February 9 shooting and were pursuing them. No public record of arrests specifically connected to the killing of Nico Honorbakhsh appeared in the months following her death in the sources that covered the story. The investigation was described as active and ongoing. Her family in Los Angeles received no public updates that were reported in the media. The broader context in which her death occurred was documented extensively by American news organizations, covering the surge in cartel-related violence affecting American tourists in Mexico in the period leading up to Spring Break 2025. The travel and tourism news site that covered her case alongside others described a situation in which officials admitted they did not have up-to-date statistics for 2024, but that experts feared the numbers of Americans killed could be even higher than previous years. The U.S. Embassy and consulates issued a stark warning ahead of spring break travel that stated violent crime, including homicide, kidnapping, carjacking, and robbery, was widespread and common in Mexico. The message from official U.S. sources had become more direct than it had been in previous years. The warning did not say Tulum specifically. It said Mexico broadly. Security experts who were interviewed in the period after Nico Honorbakhsh's death described a fundamental shift in how the cartels related to tourist areas. A private investigator, quoted by Fox News, said that tropical resorts popular with Americans were no longer off-limits for cartel killers, and that the rules had changed. The older understanding, the one that James Graham, the would-be property investor, had articulated after the 2021 shooting, the idea that cartel financial interests created a protective logic around tourist zones, was described by multiple security professionals as no longer reliable. The fragmentation of cartel authority and the rise of smaller, less disciplined local factions had eroded whatever informal protection that logic had ever provided. Nico Honorbakhsh was 44 years old. She was from Los Angeles. She had traveled to Tulum for a vacation in February 2024, the same month and nearly the same week of the month as the 2021 restaurant shooting that had killed Anjali Riot had occurred in October of that year. She was shot and killed in a drug-related incident that prosecutors determined she had no connection to. She was caught in something that had nothing to do with her, in a place that had killed foreign tourists before, where the conditions that produced that kind of death had been documented, reported on, and officially noted for years. The Belizean man who died in the same incident had drugs on his person. He was part of whatever transaction went wrong that morning. Nico Honerbach had nothing. No drugs, no connection to the dead man, no reason to be in the path of whatever violence had erupted. She was a tourist from Los Angeles, standing in a beach town in Mexico on a winter morning in 2024. Her death was covered by Fox News, CBS News, ABC News, and multiple regional outlets in the weeks after it happened. The coverage described the circumstances, quoted the prosecutor's findings about the Belizean man, noted the previous tourist deaths in Tulum, and included the State Department warnings. Then the coverage moved on to the next story. The suspects remained unidentified in public records. The investigation remained open. Nico Honerbach remained dead. Tulum's new international airport had opened 6 weeks before she was killed, in December 2023. The ribbon cutting had been attended by Mexican government officials and covered by travel publications. It was presented as the beginning of a new era for the destination. Easier access, more capacity, more visitors, more growth. 6 weeks after the airport opened, an American tourist was shot dead in a cartel-related incident in the same town the airport had been built to bring more people to. The construction of the Maya train continued. The real estate investment continued. The boutique hotels continued to open. The Instagram photographs of turquoise water and white sand continued to circulate. And the cartels continued to operate in the territory those photographs depicted. In the spaces between the hotel pools and the restaurant tables and the cenotes and the ruins, as they had been doing for years before the cameras arrived, and as they continued to do long after. 44 years old, from Los Angeles. In Tulum, on vacation, shot and killed in a drug deal that had nothing to do with her, in a town that had killed tourists before, where the cartels that made that kind of death possible had never left. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves away from tourist beaches entirely and into the interior of Mexico, where 2 American citizens were found shot to death execution-style inside a pickup truck in the state of Michoacán, a place where cartel violence had been a fact of daily life for so long that the bodies of Americans could be found on rural roads with almost no international attention at all. Section 9. Gloria Ambrise and Rafael Cardona, Michoacán, 2024. There is a version of Mexico that most Americans who visit the country never see. It is not the version with the white sand beaches and the turquoise water and the boutique hotels with infinity pools facing the Caribbean. It is not the resort corridors of Cancun or the yoga retreats of Tulum or the colonial architecture of Mexico City's tourist neighborhoods. It is the interior. The mountains and the valleys and the agricultural land that makes up the vast middle of the country, the Mexico that exists between the tourist zones and the border cities, the Mexico where millions of ordinary people live and work and raise children, and grow food, and try to build lives in places where the cartels have been the dominant force for so long that their presence is simply part of the geography. Michoacán is one of those places. The state sits on the Pacific coast of Mexico, south and west of Mexico City, and it contains some of the most beautiful and productive land in the country. The Monarch Butterfly Sanctuary is there, one of the most extraordinary natural phenomena on Earth, where hundreds of millions of butterflies migrate every year and cover the trees so completely that the forest appears to move. The coastline around Zihuatanejo and Lázaro Cárdenas is dramatic and largely undeveloped compared to the Caribbean resorts. The agricultural valleys produce avocados, limes, strawberries, and other crops that end up on American tables. The state has an identity and a history and a culture that predates its current reputation for violence by centuries. That reputation, however, is real and documented and severe. Michoacán had been a cartel battleground for decades. La Familia Michoacana, a cartel that had originally presented itself as a quasi-religious protective force for the people of the state, had controlled significant parts of Michoacán until it fractured and weakened in the early 2010s. Out of its collapse grew the Knights Templar cartel, which took the same quasi-religious branding and applied it to an organization that taxed farmers, extorted businesses, kidnapped for ransom, ran methamphetamine production operations, and used extreme and public violence to enforce its authority. The Knights Templar had been the dominant force in Michoacán when Harry DeVert rode his motorcycle through the state in January 2014 and was killed. By the mid-2010s, a combination of military pressure, civilian self-defense groups called autodefensas, and internal fracturing had weakened the Knights Templar significantly. By 2017, the cartel was considered largely disbanded. Into the space left behind came new organizations. La Familia Michoacana reorganized and re-emerged. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, one of the most powerful and fastest-growing criminal organizations in Mexico, pushed into Michoacán aggressively, fighting La Familia and other groups for control of drug production routes, agricultural extortion operations, and the ports on the Pacific coast through which enormous quantities of drugs moved. By 2024, Michoacán was contested territory between multiple armed groups, each fighting for pieces of a state whose geography, agricultural wealth, and Pacific coastline made it strategically valuable to criminal organizations. The violence that resulted from these ongoing conflicts affected everyone living in Michoacán. Farmers were taxed and extorted. Business owners paid protection or faced consequences. Local politicians navigated a landscape where the line between government authority and cartel authority was often unclear or non-existent. Ordinary people traveling rural roads moved through territory where armed checkpoints run by criminal groups were a real possibility, where the wrong vehicle, the wrong license plate, the wrong road at the wrong time could place a person in the path of men who made life and death decisions on the spot and answered to no one outside their own organization. Gloria Ambriz was 50 years old and held American citizenship. Rafael Cardona was 53 years old and also held American citizenship. The two of them were found shot to death inside a pickup truck in Michoacán in 2024. The manner in which they were killed was described as execution style, meaning they had been shot in a deliberate and targeted way rather than caught in crossfire or killed during a robbery that escalated. Investigators suspected cartel involvement in their deaths. The specific circumstances of how Gloria Ambriz and Rafael Cardona came to be in Michoacán, what road they were traveling, what town they were near, and exactly what interaction they had with whoever killed them have not been fully established in public reporting. What is documented is the outcome. 2 American citizens were found dead in a pickup truck in one of Mexico's most persistently violent states, killed in a manner consistent with cartel executions, in a year when American deaths in Mexico were already generating urgent warnings from the U.S. Embassy and consulates across the country. Their case appeared in coverage of the broader surge in cartel-related violence affecting American tourists and visitors to Mexico in the period leading up to Spring Break 2025. They were named alongside other American victims as evidence that the threat from cartel violence in Mexico had expanded beyond the border cities and the party zones, and was reaching Americans in parts of the country that rarely generated international headlines. Michoacán had been killing Americans before the world paid attention. Patrick Braxton Andrew had been killed there in 2018 while hiking in the Copper Canyon. Harry DeVert had been killed there in 2014 while riding his motorcycle toward the Pacific coast. Each of those cases had generated significant media coverage at the time, partly because the victims were solo travelers with compelling stories, and partly because their disappearances produced extended searches that kept their names in the news. Gloria Ambriz and Rafael Cardona were found together in a truck. There was no extended search. There was no weeks-long social media campaign with tens of thousands of followers. There was a discovery, an investigation, a suspicion of cartel involvement, and then the kind of silence that settles over cases in Michoacán when the people responsible for the killing are the same people who control the territory where the investigation has to take place. That silence is not accidental. It is structural. It is the product of decades of cartel infiltration into local and state law enforcement in Michoacán and across much of rural Mexico. The police in many parts of Michoacán worked alongside criminal organizations or were controlled by them. This was not a secret. It had been documented by journalists, human rights organizations, academics, and the families of victims for years. Julian LeBaron, the family member who had spoken most publicly after the 2019 massacre of the LeBaron-Langford family in Sonora, had said it directly to the New York Times. He told them it was common knowledge that the police worked with the criminals. He said they had a monopoly on security and got paid to provide protection, and later you found out they had participated in the murders of women and children. What he was describing in Sonora was equally true in Michoacán. The governor of Michoacán and successive Mexican federal administrations had all pledged to address the problem of cartel infiltration into law enforcement. The autodefensa movement had arisen specifically because communities did not trust the police to protect them from the Knights Templar and had decided to arm themselves instead. The federal government had eventually moved to absorb the autodefensas into official structures with uneven and often counterproductive results. By 2024, Michoacán remained a state where the official justice system and the cartel justice system existed in uncomfortable and often overlapping parallel, and where Americans who died in cartel-related incidents faced the same investigative environment that had produced so little accountability in the deaths of Harry DeVert and Patrick Braxton Andrew years before. The broader pattern that the deaths of Gloria Ambriz and Rafael Cardona fit into was one that U.S. officials had been tracking and documenting for years. The State Department's annual report on American citizens who died abroad consistently showed Mexico as one of the countries with the highest number of American citizen deaths from homicide. The numbers were not small. Hundreds of Americans died in Mexico every year from causes that included cartel violence, and the cases that generated international headlines, the ones like the Matamoros kidnappings or the LeBaron massacre that produced congressional hearings and presidential statements, were the visible surface of a much larger and largely invisible toll. The Americans who died quietly, found in trucks on rural roads in Michoacán, or shot in smaller cities without famous beach resorts, or killed in the border towns that generated brief local coverage and then disappeared from the national conversation, made up the majority of that toll. They were not invisible to their families. They were invisible to the broader public conversation about American safety in Mexico, which tended to focus on the cases that were dramatic enough to break through into mainstream coverage. Gloria Ambriz and Rafael Cardona were 50 and 53 years old. They were found in a pickup truck. They were American citizens. They were dead. The cartel was suspected. The U.S. State Department's travel advisory for Michoacán sat at Level 3 at the time of their deaths. Level 3 means reconsider travel. It is one step below the Level 4 do not travel designation. The advisory for Michoacán specifically stated that travelers should avoid traveling on rural roads, especially at night. It noted that criminal organizations operated throughout the state, that armed groups had established checkpoints on roads, and that travelers had been robbed and killed at those checkpoints. The advisory was specific about the danger and clear about the recommendation. It did not prevent Americans from going to Michoacán. It warned them about what they might find there. Some Americans who travel to Mexico are tourists, making a deliberate choice to visit the country. Others are visiting family members who live there. Others are people like Gloria Ambriz and Rafael Cardona, American citizens with connections to Mexico that predate the current cartel violence. People who may have grown up in the region, who have family or property or roots there, who are navigating the specific complexity of being American citizens in a place that is also in some way home. The decision to travel to Michoacán, for someone with those kinds of connections, involves a different calculation than the one a first-time tourist makes when choosing between Cancun and Tulum. It involves the weight of ties that do not disappear because a state has a Level 3 travel advisory. Whatever brought Gloria Ambriz and Rafael Cardona to Michoacán in 2024 Whatever road they were on and whatever they were doing before they were found dead in a pickup truck, they were there. They were American citizens in a state where cartels killed people on rural roads with enough regularity that finding 2 bodies in a vehicle was something local law enforcement had a procedure for. The procedure did not produce justice for them. The investigation did not produce arrests that were publicly reported. The cartels that controlled the territory where they were killed continued to control it after they were found. Their names appeared in news coverage as part of a list, evidence of a trend, data points in an argument about whether Mexico was safe for American tourists. That is a disservice to who they were. Gloria Ambriz was 50 years old. Rafael Cardona was 53. They had lives, histories, families, and connections to the places they traveled through. They were not abstractions. They were people who ended up dead in a truck in Michoacán, while the cartels that killed them went on operating in the same mountains and valleys and agricultural roads where their bodies were found. The State Department warning for Michoacán had said to avoid rural roads. The cartels had been operating in those roads for decades. The investigators assigned to cases in those areas worked in a system where the cartels had influence. The pattern that produced the deaths of Harry DeVert in 2014, Patrick Braxton Andrew in 2018, and Gloria Ambriz and Rafael Cardona in 2024 was the same pattern. Different cartel factions, different specific locations within the same vast and mountainous state, different victims who had come to Michoacán for different reasons. The same outcome: Americans dead in cartel territory, with limited accountability and limited answers for the families left behind. Michoacán is not a place most American tourists choose deliberately. It does not have the brand recognition of Cancún, or the social media presence of Tulum, or the border accessibility of Matamoros. It is interior Mexico, agricultural and mountainous, and beautiful, and controlled in significant portions by organizations that have been killing people there for decades. When Americans die there, the deaths are harder to fit into the narrative of a vacation gone wrong because the deaths do not happen in vacation places. They happen in the real Mexico, the one that exists when the Instagram filters are off and the resort walls are down and a pickup truck on a dirt road in the mountains encounters something it cannot drive away from. Gloria Ambriz was 50 years old. Rafael Cardona was 53. They were found in a truck. The cartel was suspected. They were American citizens. That is what the public record shows, and the silence around everything else is its own kind of statement about how justice works in Michoacán in 2024, and about how little has changed in the decade since Harry DeVert was found in plastic bags 40 miles from the beach he was trying to reach. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case in this collection brings the story full circle, back to a family that had already lost a son to cartel violence once before, and shows what happens when the same criminal world that took Benjamin LeBaron in 2009 came back a decade later for the women and children he had left behind, burning them in their cars on a mountain road in Sonora, while their children watched from the bushes. Section 10. Benjamin LeBaron, Chihuahua, July 7, 2009. The story of the LeBaron family and the cartels of northern Mexico did not begin on November 4, 2019, when 3 women and 6 children were burned and shot on a mountain road in Sonora. It began a decade earlier, in the summer of 2009, in a small community in the state of Chihuahua, when a young man decided that the most dangerous thing he could do in the world he lived in was stand up and say no. Benjamin LeBaron was 32 years old in the summer of 2009. He was a member of the extended LeBaron family, the same family whose women and children would be massacred 10 years later. He lived in Colonia LeBaron, a community in the state of Chihuahua, built generations earlier by American settlers who had moved to Mexico and established farming communities in the mountains of the north. The people who lived there were American citizens or held dual citizenship. They spoke English at home. They were deeply rooted in a place that sat in the middle of territory that multiple cartels had been fighting over for years. The Chihuahua of 2009 was a place under siege. The war between the Sinaloa cartel and the Juarez cartel for control of the drug smuggling routes into the United States had turned the state into one of the most violent places in the world. Ciudad Juarez, the border city directly across from El Paso, Texas, was recording murder rates that made it one of the most dangerous cities on earth during this period. The violence did not stay in the cities. It spread into the rural areas and the small communities and the agricultural valleys where families like the Lebarons had built their lives. The cartels taxed, extorted, kidnapped, and killed throughout the region. Local communities existed within that reality and had for years, navigating the space between armed criminal organizations and a government that could not or would not consistently protect them. In May 2009, a young man named Eric LeBaron, Benjamin's brother, was kidnapped by a cartel and held for ransom. The kidnappers demanded $1 million for his release. The LeBaron family refused to pay. They organized their community, reached out to Mexican officials, and created enough public pressure that the kidnappers released Eric LeBaron unharmed after 1 week, without receiving the ransom they had demanded. For most people living in northern Mexico in 2009, the story would have ended there. Eric was home. The family had survived. The smart and safe thing to do was absorb the experience, be grateful for the outcome, and go back to the quiet and careful life that survival in cartel territory required. Speaking out was dangerous. Organizing against the cartels was dangerous. Putting your name publicly on opposition to criminal organizations that had no hesitation about killing entire families was the kind of decision that ended lives. Benjamin LeBaron made that decision anyway. He became one of the most publicly visible anti-crime activists in Chihuahua in the months after his brother's kidnapping. He spoke to media. He organized within his community and the surrounding region. He pushed back against the criminal organizations that had terrorized the area for years, arguing publicly that communities had to stand together and refuse to accept the cartel's authority over their lives. He put his name on his opposition in a region where doing so was understood by everyone, including Benjamin himself, to carry serious personal risk. He was a father, he had children, he had a wife, he had a community that looked to him as someone willing to speak when others stayed silent. He knew what he was doing, and he did it anyway. On the night of July 7, 2009, approximately 15 armed men arrived at the LeBaron family home in Colonia Lebaron. They came at night, when the family was inside. They stormed the house. Benjamin LeBaron and his brother-in-law Luis Widmar were inside. The armed men beat both of them, and then shot them dead. They were killed in front of their families. The attackers left. Benjamin LeBaron was 32 years old. His brother-in-law, Luis Widmar, died with him. The Mexican authorities who investigated the killings subsequently arrested the alleged leader of the cartel group responsible for ordering and carrying out the attack. The arrest was made and reported. What followed in the Mexican justice system, what charges were pursued, what sentences were handed down, and whether the full network responsible for the murders was ever held accountable, has never been comprehensively documented in public reporting, in the way that the 2019 massacre later was. What the murder of Benjamin LeBaron established, with absolute clarity, was the price of speaking out in that part of Mexico. The cartels had kidnapped his brother. The family had refused to pay and organized instead of submitting. And within 2 months, the most visible face of that resistance was dead. The message was not subtle. It was not intended to be. The killing of Benjamin LeBaron in front of his family in their home was meant to be seen and understood by every family in every community in the region that was thinking about whether to follow his example. Most of them did not follow it. Most of them went quiet. And stayed quiet because they understood what the cartels were willing to do to people who did not. The LeBaron family did not go entirely quiet. Some of them stayed. Some continued to organize in quieter ways. Some members of the extended family moved between Mexico and the United States, maintaining connections on both sides of the border. Julian LeBaron, who would become the most publicly vocal family member after the 2019 massacre, continued to speak about cartel violence and the failure of the Mexican government to protect communities like theirs. He had watched his brother die in 2009, and he continued to put his name on opposition to the criminal organizations responsible. The community of Colonia Lebaron and its sister settlement of La Mora in Sonora continued to exist. The families who lived there continued to farm their land and raise their children and drive the dirt roads through the mountains that connected their isolated communities to the rest of the region. They did so within the reality of cartel territory, maintaining whatever accommodations and understandings were necessary to continue living in a place that belonged, in a practical sense that had nothing to do with any map or any law, to criminal organizations. For 10 years after Benjamin's murder, the broader world largely forgot about the LeBaron family. They were a small community in the mountains of northern Mexico, American citizens by descent, living in a place that most Americans had never heard of and would never visit. The 2009 killing had generated some coverage at the time, mostly in the context of the broader reporting on cartel violence in Chihuahua during one of the bloodiest periods of the Mexican drug war. Then the coverage moved on to the next story. The next story that involved the LeBaron family at the level of international attention was November 4, 2019, when Ronita Miller, Donna Ray Langford, and Christina Marie Langford Johnson were killed on that mountain road in Sonora, along with 6 of their children. The connection to the 2009 murder of Benjamin LeBaron became part of how the international media contextualized the attack. Here was a family that had already been targeted by cartel violence a decade earlier. Here was a community that had already paid in blood for the decision to live in that territory and to speak out against the criminal organizations that controlled it. The 2019 massacre looked different when you knew that 2009 had happened first. It looked like a continuation, like the cartels had never really finished what they started. Julian LeBaron, speaking to the New York Times after the 2019 massacre, described the relationship between his family and the cartels of northern Mexico with the clarity of someone who had been living inside that relationship for his entire adult life. He told the paper that there could be no mistaken identity in the 2019 attack because the surviving children had told them that one of the women had tried to identify herself to stop the attack and had been shot anyway. He said it was common knowledge in that part of Mexico that the police worked with the criminals. He said the cartels had a monopoly on security. He said this was not a surprise. He said they had been living with this reality for years. He had also, 10 years earlier, watched his cousin Benjamin get beaten and shot dead in his own home for saying exactly that kind of thing publicly. The decade between 2009 and 2019 in the LeBaron family's story is not a decade of peace interrupted by 2 violent episodes. It is a decade in which a family lived inside ongoing cartel territory, managing the risks of that existence, losing members to that violence, and continuing to exist in a place that the Mexican state could not fully protect them in, and that the criminal organizations that surrounded them had demonstrated a willingness to kill them for occupying. Benjamin LeBaron's children grew up without their father. The family member who had been willing to speak publicly, who had organized his community after his brother's kidnapping, who had refused to accept the cartel's authority over his family's life, was buried in the cemetery at Colonia Lebaron when he was 32 years old. His wife raised their children in the same community where their father had been killed. Across the mountains in Sonora, the community of La Mora continued its life. Ronita Miller was 20 years old in 2009 when Benjamin was killed. She was 30 when she was murdered, along with 4 of her children in 2019. Donna Ray Langford was 33 in 2009. She was 43 when she was shot dead in her Suburban. Christina Langford Johnson was 19 in 2009. She was 29 when she raised her hands to show cartel gunmen she was unarmed and was shot through the chest. The children who survived the 2019 massacre, the ones who were shot and walked miles through the mountains to get help, had been born into a world that already included the murder of Benjamin LeBaron as a fact of their family's history. Devin Langford, who was 13 when he hid his siblings in the bushes and walked 14 miles to Lamora, was 3 years old when Benjamin was killed. Mackenzie Langford, who walked 10 miles alone with a bullet in her wrist, was not yet born when the armed men came to the house in Colonia Lebaron in 2009. By the time they were old enough to understand what had happened to their family, the 2009 murder was not a story someone had told them. It was part of the landscape they lived in. It was part of what their family was. The $4.64 billion judgment handed down by the federal court in North Dakota in June 2022 was awarded specifically for the 2019 massacre. The families of the 9 people killed that day were the plaintiffs. The Juarez cartel and La Línea were the defendants. The judge found that the massacre constituted an act of terrorism. The anti-terrorism law under which the case was filed automatically tripled the initial damages calculation to reach the final number. The cartel did not appear at the trial. They did not send lawyers. They did not respond to the summons. They did not acknowledge the proceedings in any way. The law firm representing the families filed more than 1,200 separate claims against assets seized from drug traffickers by U.S. law enforcement in operations around the country, working to convert a judgment that was initially considered symbolic into actual money that could reach the people it had been awarded to. Some of those claims produced results. In February 2024, a court in Ohio awarded the families approximately $9.93 million from assets seized during a drug bust in June 2023. The New York Federal Prosecutor's Office challenged other claims the law firm had filed, creating a legal dispute that was still ongoing as of mid-2024. The Benjamin LeBaron murder of 2009 was not included in those proceedings. It was too old. The legal mechanisms available to the families applied to the 2019 attack. The 2009 murder was a separate crime in a separate state, and whatever accountability had been sought for it had been sought through Mexican legal channels that produced an arrest and then fell largely out of public documentation. What the two events together represent is something that the legal proceedings and the political statements and the congressional hearings could not fully capture. They represent what it costs to be an American family living in a place that the cartels control. The cost is not abstract. It is not statistical. It is Benjamin LeBaron, beaten and shot in his own home at 32 years old. It is Ronita Miller, burning in a Tahoe with her 8-month-old twins. It is Christina Langford Johnson, shot through the chest on a dirt road with her hands in the air. It is 13-year-old Devin Langford, walking alone through the mountains at night, after watching his mother die. The family that Benjamin LeBaron belonged to, the family he died trying to protect by speaking out against the people who threatened it, lost 9 more members 10 years after his death. His murder in 2009 did not prevent the 2019 massacre. His courage in standing up, which cost him his life, did not make his community safer. The cartels that killed him were still operating in the same mountains a decade later. They were still killing Americans. They were still burning cars. They were still shooting women who raised their hands. Julian LeBaron was still speaking publicly in 2024. He was still putting his name on opposition to the criminal organizations that had killed his cousin in 2009 and killed 9 of his relatives in 2019. He was doing what Benjamin had done, saying the same things Benjamin had said, in the same mountains where Benjamin had said them. He was still alive as of the time this was written. The cartels were still there too. The cemetery at Lamora holds the graves of Donna Ray Langford, her sons Trevor and Rogan, and others from the 2019 massacre. The cemetery at Colonia Lebaron holds Benjamin's grave. Both communities are still there. The families are still there, or are divided between Mexico and the United States, or have left entirely for places where the mourning does not begin with a calculation about which roads are safe and which are not. 15 years of documented cartel attacks on American citizens in Mexico. A teacher on a hiking trip. A blogger on a motorcycle. Tourists at a nightclub and a restaurant table. Friends from South Carolina, trying to get to a doctor's appointment. A woman on vacation in a beach town. Two Americans on a rural road in Michoacan. 3 women and 6 children driving to a family wedding. A man who said no to the cartels when everyone around him stayed quiet. They were all Americans. They were all in Mexico for reasons that made complete sense to them. They were all killed by the same reality, the same organizations, the same indifference to their lives that the cartels of northern and central Mexico have applied to anyone who gets in their way, or gets in their path, or simply exists in their territory at the wrong moment. None of them are coming back. The cartels that killed them are still operating. Some of the men responsible were arrested, most were not. The investigations that were opened are mostly still open. The judgments that were handed down are mostly uncollected. The families are living with permanent losses that no legal proceeding and no political statement and no dollar amount will ever fill. Benjamin LeBaron stood up in 2009 and said that communities had to refuse to accept what the cartels were doing to them. He was 32 years old. He had children. He knew the risk. 15 years later, the cartels he spoke out against are still in those mountains, still controlling those roads, still collecting their taxes from the farmers and the businesses and the communities that have no choice but to keep living in the territory the cartels claim as their own. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.